paragraphs to cover, to dig apart a little bit before we go in. So yes, so welcome. I guess we're live streaming now. So welcome to this week's installment of our Kenneth Smith philosophy series. This is our arc on Millennia and Microcosm, the forthcoming book, which was published in the years 1998, 9, and 2000 in the Comics Journal as the column End Times. We are in the fourth installment called Ancient Civilization, which does a deep dive on the perspective, the unique worldview held by the ancient epoch, which is very different from the medieval epoch's worldview and very different from the modern epoch's worldview. And we're trying to get to the point where we can see it not as a caricature, but as they saw themselves and as they saw the world. We are last week we got most of the way through part B, custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy. This week we're going to do the last two paragraphs of that and then move on to section C. In each of these subsections in part 4, he's exploring some what do I want to say, some perspective or some angle or some distinctive part of the ancient epoch's worldview that's radically different from the way we see things, in order to help break us loose from our assumption that everybody in the past must have just either been like us or been some savage or primitive version of ourselves, where he's trying to, point by point, confront us with our assumptions and show how they saw things very differently, and not necessarily in an inferior way, just an alternative way.
Okay. Now he seems to be saying here that this condition we have as human beings, when we look at the leader and we say, tell us what we want to hear, was so obvious in ancient Greece.
Yes.
Our tendency towards self-delusion is where we as a group or a people or as a nation look to our leaders and say, tell us what we want to hear.
Yes.
But this was obvious in ancient times to a few people, but seems to have gotten a bit lost in the modern day, in the modern day world, which has so many details.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's one of the classic differences between the ancient world and its worldview and the modernist world and its worldview is that in the ancient world, the people who worked the hardest to see things clearly understood that the human brain is not an organ of truth. It doesn't pump true information throughout our bodies the way that our heart pumps blood. They understood that it has a different function than that, and that function is a two-edged sword, that it can help us to find patterns and form communities, and it can help us to find the truth, but it is at least as likely to lead us into falsehood, especially false things that please us, placida, a recurring term in the ancient world, and that it is, they had a recognition that it is impossible to become a wise person without a complete acceptance of the truth about oneself, that one's own inner nature is fighting against the truth at all times. And you have to be watching it and struggling against it, learning its tricks, learning how it seduces us into what it is that we feel we want or what it is that we think we want, in the gnosis or noetic traps, the twin traps of the half-minded mentalities that we're born with.
So you can eternally sell a good outcome to the public with a program that delivers a good outcome, eternally sell it, and you can come back and you can fool them every time, as long as you tell them just around the corner is paradise.
Yes, because especially in the modern epoch, the people who think of themselves as the smartest don't accept this idea that the brain is a trap and that the brain is trying to lure us into falsehood. We believe that we see things truly and objectively, unlike previous epochs, that we have a birthright of science and reason and objectivity. And just by being born in this era, we believe we have a better access to the truth than those past savage, terrifying people were. And therefore, although you must be logical and you should try to be rational, we have all these oughts. When you look at them, they don't add up to anything like the level of sophistication of awareness or defense against our own pseudophilia that the people who struggled the most in the ancient world were able to achieve. And it sets us up so that even smart people in the modern epoch fall for what you're describing, Stephen. There is this desire to believe that the truth can just be poured into the head like water. The purpose of education is to fill the head with facts. And once you have facts and you reason about them, you will obviously inevitably come to the truth, because we see it as a simple operation. That predisposes us to be victims of marketing, of propaganda, you name it. We're like we've been perfectly cultivated to create the kinds of problems you're talking about. And the Greeks saw that those things happened all the time in the ancient world, but they were also fighting against it, and they were trying to create a culture that warned even the most obtuse people to have what let's see, I guess Professor Bridgman in my history class at the University of Washington back in 1985-86, he said one of the characteristics of peasants in the medieval epoch, and sometimes even into the present, is what they called a kind of peasant cunning or peasant savvy, where they assumed that somebody who walked into the village saying good news was probably a con man. They were hostile to outsiders because they recognized that people coming with amazingly good news were almost certainly trying to part you from the things that mattered. And that was inculcated into peasant culture for thousands of years, in Europe and around the world.
So Sir Isaac Newton fell for the South Sea bubble.
Yes.
He blew all his cash.
Yes. And so in the modern epoch, it is as though in our quest for these ideals of truth and justice and science and objectivity and the bold new world of progress, we have managed to strip away thousands of years of peasant cunning from ourselves. And instead of being very hard to con, we've made ourselves into being very easy to con, while at the same time, and for this very reason, believing ourselves to be impossible to con. Right? Study after study shows everybody believes that everybody believes advertising works on other people, but not on them. They think they themselves are too clever to be persuaded by advertising. But it's all those other suckers out there that fall for it. Except marketing studies show when you actually look at people's spending patterns, the very people who think that they're immune to marketing are the ones who spend more after a good marketing campaign. So they don't know themselves or what they're doing well enough. They've got this big gullibility size hole that makes them what Kenneth Smith calls useful idiots. Not idiot as an insult, but preoccupied with themselves and their own interests. They lack the perspective to understand how they're being wielded as tools instead of being fully fledged people with a proper modicum of peasant cunning that ought to be our defenses against always being conned over and over and over. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this brings up a very important and deep point I think you guys have been talking about. It seems to me truth and falsity depends on the internal understanding and the external facticity. And it just seems to emphasize that you got to take care of the internal stuff more in terms of understanding your own truth and falsity in order to be able to take in information in I won't say rational, I say reasonable way. So, which means that a lot of it rides on education, but then depending what kind of education, because of the kind of education that sort of like fills you with facts and procedures to fit into a system, and in a sense fits you into this structure, and you are not, in a sense, criticizing and analyzing it in a way that could take it apart and understand the falsity. And I also like the fact that, the idea, the cunning of the falsity, you know, that, you know, now we call them confidence man,
Yes,
right? I mean, like, they take you into the confidence.
that's right.
So they are telling you the truth.
I'm
You
a
know, I mean,
Nigerian prince.
so they're not peddling something that you are suspicious of them. You are in confidence with them. And so confidence has seeped into the inside, into the interior, to deconstruct the mechanism that you have in terms of defending yourself against these falsities by
Yeah.
presenting facticity in such a way that it all seems to make sense.
That's right.
That's all I want to say. That in a sense, I think a lot of people don't understand. I think that's why I myself have always, you know, a little bit more hazy about that, because I always doubt a lot of things, including myself, you know, and so, and if I don't at least trust myself completely, then I'm not going to trust hearsay from something else. So,
Right.
so I think if you don't doubt yourself to a certain degree, then you're in a whole hell lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Because you will not only accept the confidence, you will spread the confidence.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. There's this way in which we want to be taken into confidence. We want the secrets. We want the trust. And so the con man uses that specific angle. It's you and me against the world, buddy. We're gonna, it's dangerous out there, but it's safe in here. This is not just con men, but every domestic abuser uses this same technique to isolate their victims. Social isolation is well documented as one of the initial stages in spouse battering. And it works through the exact same con man mechanism. It's, you can't trust the world. It's full of scary things, but together we stand a chance. It's you and me against the world. And while you're looking out at all the threats out there, I'm picking your pocket. That's how every con man works, right? And cults, yeah, you're right, Joseph. Yeah, they're and the reason that they're all using the same technique is that it goes very, very close to the core of the structure of the human mind. It's a universal, and if we don't know that about ourselves, then we're just vulnerable to it. And we're not only vulnerable to it, we're complicit in it. The uneducated, the fact that we don't know that we're doing that means that we'll blunder into con situations over and over. Without knowing that it's not entirely an accident. It's because we're wired that way to want to do it. Unless we learn that it's dangerous, unless we learn the way in which we're working against ourselves, we'll just keep repeating that unhealthy pattern. So, again, we go over and over to the Oracle at Delphi, Gnothi Seauton. It's like, yeah, the world is going to present an enormous number of challenges and difficulties for us in life, but we're going to walk right towards those difficulties over and over and step into minefields and blind alleys and off cliffs until we learn that we're doing that. So that, the first step towards having a defense against the world is having a defense against yourself and the ways in which you're going to just blunder into these tragedies. Donald, go ahead. Oops. Sorry, I just accidentally muted you. Come off mute.
Oh. I want to appeal to Sharon here by pedantically following the text of these paragraphs for just a minute, just for a minute. In the first sentence, out of these two conditioning ways, is the antecedent of two the philosophy and science of the previous paragraph? I should sign up with David to be an editor or something.
Let's see.
He says the Greeks came to invent philosophy and science, and then being in the next paragraph, it's out of these two, and that
second to the last paragraph under B.
Yeah. He's got this line before that about not just Greek philosophy, but politics, myth, and tragic drama all serve the purpose of curbing idiotism and subjectivism. out of these two conditioning ways. Oh, two conditioning ways of understanding. Okay, this is about the whole section. Oh, okay, very good question. Yes, and editing might be wise here, because the two ways of understanding he's talking about are A and B, right? Each, section 4 breaks down into A, B, C, D, E, and what he's doing here towards the end of B is doing a cumulative summary, saying that when you put A and B together, what you get is an understanding of how the authority of nature applies not just to the world around us, but to the world inside of us, and therefore to the ways that we need to be handling custom and culture, and the way we need to be designing them. We have to take into account this understanding of the way that people delude themselves, and that is their nature, and that nature is authoritative, katefuse, just because it is nature. When you put those two together, then you understand that the fact that people keep doing this isn't just some detail or coincidence, but it's core to the character of Homo sapiens. And that raises the degree of the challenge, which therefore, makes them think, if the challenge is that big, then we can't just pay lip service or make an occasional effort to do something about it. We have to organize our entire civilization to directly confront this challenge, to give us a chance, because we're now fighting nature itself. And nature has this profound authority.
Okay.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Well, at the end of the sentence, I'll continue my pedantism there.
Please.
He says, must indeed strive for what is excellent, the best ever said or done. And I would just point out that that's another one of those Homer things, the best ever said or done so far.
Yes.
There's no Platonic excellence of, the eternal idea. You can beat you might be so good as it would stand for all of history, but that's something that history would have to reveal.
Right.
This is continual striving. And of course, we know that when he says excellent, he's referring back to arete, the specific thing. A few sentences down, or maybe the next sentence, he uses the word aristocrat. And that's to me a funny word, because I think the Greek is kalokagathos, the beautiful and the good were the aristocrats. That they didn't really have, they talked about aristocracy, but the people that made up the aristocracy were the kaloskagathos. It's a phrase that's been scrunched, beautiful and good, into kalokagathos. So it refers to people that are both beautiful and good. That's kind of, I don't know if that's interesting or not.
Very.
But.
And very important.
And the last word of that, I think, is when he talks about pseudotropism. That's a false turning or changing of direction. And interesting there is that's also a false trophy. The Greeks had the word trophy, but it wasn't participation trophies. It was a turning. And it was the turning in a battle when the two phalanxes met and one turned back, started getting pushed back. That was a turning, and that's where they erected the trophy as to who won the battle, because that was the turning that decided the battle.
Yes.
And so you got a trophy. I don't know if it's all circular, I think. In the following paragraph, again, this is something you'll say later. aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment. And that's, again, that's character. That's another one of those references, I think, to it's their character. You know, it's not the ethos in the sense of the sort of general mores of a people. It's, right.
It's their nature.
It's their nature. Very good. And I thought, a few bit down, there's the word unless, where he says, unless there are exceptional individuals willing to pay the social and psychological price. And maybe unless makes sense, but I kind of jarred me a little bit because it's unless phusis, without phusis providing the population with people with the right ethos or character, this doesn't happen. We don't escape, well, we don't escape our delusion. As he says, there'll be no such thing as truth or acute insight. It's not like that you take a whole bunch of people incapable of achieving truth or insight and somehow it appears as a group property.
Right.
You have to have phusis. You can't just inbreed your population forever and get anything but Alabama or Mississippi. You're not going to get Athens. No, that's a joke, but it is that there's this other component. There's kind of what we choose and try to do and strive to do and what our character is. But there's also this phusical or component from phusis. Phusis has to give up or provide the raw material for the kalos and kagathos to walk among us and show us truth and insight.
Yes.
And if they don't, and that's enough. But Sharon, did I try and follow the text enough for you? You know, I just some words as I read these. You go off on words a lot, and I was reading this at a time when you had done something, and I thought, oh yeah, this is a good case of where these words carry. I think if I know Kenneth, these words carry more because I've been taken to the woodshed about what phusis provides and what willfulness provides enough times to know that we're not tabula rasa, and if we just will ourselves to be the aristocrats, everything will be better. It won't.
Right.
Because we can't do it. We got to have help.
Yeah.
That's enough.
Oh boy, that's good. We'll spend the next couple hours unpacking that, but before we do, I'm gonna call on Sharon. So go ahead, Sharon.
Because I like that word pseudotropism. You know, that whole sentence, he says, before there were high potency pharmaceuticals, the task of constructing a subjectively gratifying virtual reality fell to culture, religion, orthodoxy, ideology, and other intimate pseudotropism. Now, if you remember in your basic science, the amoeba, how he put out those false feet and engulf whatever you wanted, that's what a pseudotropic exercise is. So
Yeah.
I thought that was a very interesting use of this word in this context.
Yeah, I agree. It's the analogy with sunflowers is so important here. Donald's Right, and Sharon, you're right to be always questioning his use of language, because Kenneth works so hard. The initial impression is, oh my God, it's a wall of words, and you think he must just be throwing words at the screen. But he works so hard to pick the right words, and he's often looking for rhymes and rhythms and myths and legends and allusions and so forth. So, he said that before he wrote Dramas of the Mind, which was his first column for the Comics Journal, before that he took some time off and spent, I can't remember how many years he said, just tearing apart his use of language all the way back down and building it up from the bottom, from a new foundation, trying, because he saw his use of popular definitions of words as having been an impediment all his career long as a philosopher to clearly stating what he means. He looked at the ways that students misunderstood things, and he saw that it's because the language he was using wasn't rigorous enough and precise enough. And because, as we've talked about before, modern culture has seized upon every important word and redefined it in a way that reinforces the modernist worldview and erases the possibility of the medieval and ancient worldviews or any other worldviews. And so he worked to rebuild his language. And so it's always rewarding with Kenneth Smith. It's never gratuitous to pick apart his words and say, well, why is he using these words here? And sometimes, we're going to miss stuff, and that's just fine. Maybe we'll get it next time. And sometimes we'll spot things that he missed and see more opportunities. I think what Donald's doing here with Kalos Kagathos, which I put a link to, is really valuable. This idea that when we translate Plato or Aristotle or anybody else, and we say, well, this is if the government is an aristocracy, then that must mean that the people who are governing are aristocrats, right? We and therefore we translate the term Kalos Kagathos as aristocrats and say it's run by the aristocrats. But in doing so, we are doing a precisely modernist thing that very exactly destroys the ancient meaning that was implicit in it. And the way that you can see that is that, what we're saying basically is that, an aristocrat is anybody who runs an aristocracy, whoever that happens to be. Anybody who just lucks out and happens to get in charge and declares themselves, yay, we're the aristocrats. We think that's what the Greeks mean by aristocracy, because that's what we mean by aristocracy. And we can't conceive of anything different from that. It must be some kind of con game, right? And they're violating democracy. Whereas what Aristotle means is, and he's very clear about this, by the way, in the Politics, which I reread last week. What he's saying is, well, there's two different kinds of aristocracy. One of them actually is an aristocracy, and the other one is merely an oligarchy. And an oligarchy is what we call an aristocracy. It's a bunch of guys who declare themselves the best and get in charge and say, hooray, we win because we're in charge. Whereas he said, that's a rotten form of government. He says a better form of government is an aristocracy. And in an aristocracy, it's not run by whoever happens to run it. It's run by aristoi, who are defined by being kalos kagathos, the good and the beautiful, which he defines as very precise terms, and they're very well understood within Greek culture what they're talking about. They don't mean people who call themselves good. They don't mean people who other people call good. Likewise, beautiful. They don't mean people who are just physically beautiful or believe they're beautiful. And he's not talking about people who other people think that they're beautiful. He's talking about the hidden harmony. He's talking about people who have attached themselves to the archai of the cosmos, who are focused on aligning their own behavior and character and that of society with the harmonies of nature. And because of that alignment, they're able to lead people away from falsehoods, even attractive falsehoods, in the direction of those principles that will allow a civilization to survive for the long term. The good and the beautiful is not a form of praise. It's a technical diagnosis that he's doing here. But it's a technical diagnosis that means nothing to moderns, because for us, the words good and the word beautiful don't have anything to do with the hidden harmony or archai or phusis, because we don't have any of those words or concepts. Our notion is of a great meaningless machine, and you just push the buttons and get the results. And therefore, all of these words have been redefined in these meaningless ways, such that it's impossible to make the distinction that Aristotle makes between the good governance by the few, which is aristocracy, and the bad governance between the few, which is oligarchy. We're incapable of making that distinction the way that he made it. So it's understandable why translator after translator would translate the Greek into the word aristocrat. But it's far more strange and insightful to translate it literally as the good and the beautiful, or to use the term the kalos kagathos, because it forces us to confront one of the places where we are really not understanding the ancient perspective, and we need to know that we're not getting it. So thank you, Donald. I think that was a particularly potent thing. And there's a lot more here we'll get into.
Well, since you're so up on your Aristotle, kalos, nothing can be kalos that does not exhibit excellence. A form of, the beauty is fitness to function or something. What a beautiful human being is not one that's pleasing to look at.
Right.
It's one that is excellent in their functioning as a human being.
Yes.
It's
totally
I mean, Aristotle goes on and on about this, and you just look, you shake your head. What is this? But it's beauty meant something different.
Yes. Yes.
Good. They had strong meanings for them, as you pointed out.
Yeah, very strongly defined. And the experience of reading Aristotle, a translation of Aristotle, of course, for most of us, at first it sounds like he's rationalizing, right? Because we can't conceive of him in his own terms. So when he says the beautiful, is what has this fitness of form to function, we think he's trying to justify why we admire things that are beautiful. We start thinking about Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner, other beautiful people, and we start thinking, do they have a fitness of form to function? We'll look at a great athlete and we'll say, oh, are they beautiful because we're trying to do a modern trick, which is to shore up a subjectivism to make it seem like it's objective, right? And we assume that's what he's doing. And you can spend an entire career studying Aristotle as a modern and never once clue in that the way that we're approaching him is precisely backwards. He's not saying, let's rationalize the beautiful and pump it up by giving it all these extra, accolades. He's saying we're wrong about what's beautiful. The things that are beautiful are the things that have the amazing fit of form to function. That's what we should be admiring as beautiful. And, we should just chuck out our weird subjective aesthetic stuff that is completely irrelevant to it. Or study it as a curiosity, but not study it as the first principle. But for moderns, our idiotia, our immersion in our own experience, our own feelings, our own ideas is so strong that we can go an entire lifetime and never, even looking directly at things that challenge that self-insulation and self-obsession, and never once clue in that we're being offered a chance to look at things differently in a more profound way. It's really quite interesting. And I'm talking about this not to diss on other people, but I'm talking about my own experience of reading Aristotle and how easy it is when I start reading Aristotle at first to go, well, he's just wasting time puffing up things that people admire. You can really get quite a ways into it before you clue in that's not what he's doing at all, and I'm completely misreading him. And it's partially exacerbated by the translation, but really what it comes from is the core ethos of modernism and how we naturally interpret the things that we encounter. So if you have that experience with Aristotle or Plato or Heraclitus or Hegel, it starts to wake you up to what a profound Procrustean bed the modernist ethos makes of the human mind. How completely we can invert what we're looking at and misinterpret it, not in details, but in its completely in its essence from beginning to end, and not notice that we're doing it while thinking the whole time that we're seeing it clearly, because we're that lost in the realm of modernist ideas that we can't distinguish them from what's real. It's really amazing to see how complete an immersion it is. And until you have that experience where you catch yourself 180 degrees off the truth because of your natural modernist reflexes. It's hard to believe what Kenneth Smith is saying in this book, The Series of Columns, that we are trapped until we learn to see the world from multiple worldviews, because we can't conceive of how warped a single worldview is. Let's see. I think Phil's spoken once, so I'm going to do Stephen and then Phil this time, if that's all right. So go ahead, Stephen. You're looking for your mute.
Yeah, it's just, I've been using the Bluetooth mouse, but it seems a little bit slow sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, this question there, you're saying Smith looked into language. He looked into the way he was using language. Yeah, on a small level, that's something I've done where I've looked at the etymology of words. I've wanted to see how the usage of a word has evolved over time.
Yeah.
And my philosophical compatriots keep on telling me I'm wasting my time. They say, we don't care how a word was used in the past.
Right.
It only matters how we're using the word now.
Right.
Now, most of these people are atheists, and I'm just trying to figure out how do we come to, how do we universally use a word in a certain way that's true? I could imagine, like, if there's some sort of God or some sort of divine, there's some sort of divine power which is programming us with the word usage all the time.
Right.
Okay, that's a good theory. I can buy that. That could work. But when you're saying that we're just these pieces of protoplasm which are somehow getting all these correct meanings, how can I have a correct meaning that's universal amongst a nation of men or whatever?
Right.
How do we get there?
Right.
But they're saying, oh, it's as easy as pie. It just naturally happens.
The magic hand.
And, I just wonder about, two words I really hate, commonality and problematic, because I looked into the word problematic was used in mathematics to refer to an unsolvable, what they believe is an unsolvable equation, but possibly it could be solved. I mean, but it's saying this is like 99.99% chance that we're not going to be able to solve it. That is problematic.
Right.
It's not just a problem which we could perhaps solve. And
right.
The other one's commonality, which used to refer to the common people or the common culture. Rather than using the word similarity, we've assumed that all these entities have something in common rather than the word similarity, which we already know. It's just we think when we say something is similar, we're saying we think they're similar. That's ingrained in the word. When we start saying commonality, we're saying we know that they're all the same.
Right. Right.
So yeah, this usage of terminology. Well, I've been told checking over your language is now a waste of time. Well, we don't even do grammar in the Western world anymore.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, this is a pet peeve of mine too. I'm right there with you. And the radical descriptivists who think of themselves as completely moderate believe that anything other than going with whatever the majority thinks is completely insane. They believe that if the majority thinks a thing, it is true. And so it is impossible that there could be some concept that we need the ability to communicate clearly, and yet people could get it wrong. They think that's impossible. They think if the majority believes that the process, the sequence of political parties, one after another in a country, each kind of, inflicting whatever changes to the government that they want to satisfy their constituents. If that results in a series of changes over 40 years, then if the population refers to that as evolution, then ipso facto, it must actually be evolution. And thereby it must carry with it the imprimatur and authority of nature itself. And so, in that way, if we were more scrupulous about our language, we might call corruption, we instead decide is progress and the will of nature and God itself, because everybody's decided to call it evolution. This idea that the majority can be wrong, that just because we all said so doesn't make it so, and that in fact, even if all 7 billion people decide that a word means something, it might not actually mean that. And by which we mean there may be some concept crucial to the survival of Homo sapiens that if we don't keep it in mind and we don't organize our societies around it, we're going to fail. That's unthinkable to a radical descriptivist. If we've decided to forget it through the evolution of language, then it cannot possibly be important. There are no things outside the scope of popular culture that can possibly matter. And if you try to coin a term and then everybody yanks it the other way, well, the problem is you, not them. This gets exacerbated when we start to see the way that political parties with their propaganda will intentionally change the definition of a word in order to mislead people. This happens all the time. There are think tanks all over the United States that do this. This is what they do. They bring in focus groups. They look for ways to warp the meanings of words. They then spread them out. They send them out to all of the political agents who then use them in their speeches and use them in their television programs and so forth with the new meaning. They begin to mock the old meaning, and it gets to where you're not allowed to use the old definition. And here, it's not even the natural drift of the population's attention span that has led to the change. It's deliberate sabotage. But you're not allowed to say that, because if the majority is conned into the new definition, then it is now the right definition, according to radical descriptivism, ipso facto. And therefore, the propagandists are validated by this theory. So it's like descriptivism and prescriptivism in an adult world are two approaches to looking at language, both of which have their uses and which have to be melded and used together. But under the radical descriptivist program, prescriptivism is evil and must never, ever, ever be done for any reason. And, radical descriptivism is portrayed as freedom and truth and justice and the American way and all the other good things. It's apple pie. And in so doing, you see an ideology that allows us over time to forget things, including things that are very, very important to remember, and often not by accident. Commonality, yeah. Problematic, yeah. Those are the original definitions were things that we needed the ability to say. And as we erode the words away, we get to a point where some things become inexpressible. And therefore, since they're not easy to express, people stop thinking them. They stick with the thoughts that are easy to express with the language that they have. Language as a tool of empire has been well known for centuries. Orwell wrote a whole book about it, right? But radical descriptivism pretends that no such thing happens and that we shouldn't worry our little heads about, what might be happening to our ability to understand and describe the world. Obviously, radical prescriptivism is possible too. It just hasn't been a serious force for 150 years. I don't know how long it's been since it was ever a serious threat. Phil, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank Donald for what he said, because it was sort of important to me. And it's like, it made me realize that I guess in quotes, I'm kind of a primitive to a certain degree, because it made me realize how Greek I am, even though I'm Chinese. So the thing that rattled me off was what you said about summing up the two chapters, beauty and goodness, I guess you would call that as virtues and how that relates to truth, which is the classic circle of virtues, I guess, in the Catholic Church. And I was thinking about that, and my thought is that even though I admire Kant and Hegel, I ultimately disagree with them in this sense, right? Because I think they embed the final decision that the mind is the bearer of truth. And I always feel that the mind is important and reason is important, but there's other factors about the world that is transformative. And, I was in the Hegel meeting, and it's a very good meeting. So I think I finally got clear what Hegel was talking about, and we got to the absolute mind. And he claims that in a way that in the final three, this is not the final four basketball, the final three is really philosophy, art, and religion. And they are dealing in some sense with this triangle. Maybe I shouldn't say triangle, this circular relationship is the way I would like to put it. I think he puts it more like a triangle. And I would characterize what he says as a kind of rocket that's heading into the escape velocity. And what happened is you jettison art and you jettison religion because they're really just the inferior, incomplete manifestation of truth embedded in representation. And that only philosophy is the bearer of truth in the purest sense. Even in nature, he says, yes, nature is imbued with truth, but it doesn't have the consciousness to understand it. And it needs the mind to instantiate the truth as in nature. And I don't think it operates that way. I think of it as I would call it the hermeneutic circle in which they interact and they relate to each other, and that's constantly revolving. And I was particularly objecting, and in fact, I tried to quiz that, like, well, if the past evolution of history have shown that in philosophy, there's been a history of mistaken identities. And does Hegel recognize that he might be also one of the mistaken identities that think he has arrived?
Yeah.
Or has he concluded, no, actually, how lucky he happened to be at the right moment in history to say, no, we finally arrived at
Yes.
a resolution of what that is.
Yes.
And that part I really disagree. And that in some sense, nature still have some secrets that we do not understand, right?
Yeah.
That maybe nature is not conscious of it. Nature feels its way through this structure in its own way. And it just seems to me jettisoning that as a kind of the impure representation, and that the mind is able to actually articulate it in a, I would almost call it a transcendental way, is to me false. And I said, well, I agree with him insofar as I now understand what he's talking about, but I just disagree, right?
Yeah.
Because we are still in this process of getting to it. And so therefore you need this sort of circular relationship in order to sustain the development of the possibilities. And I think, I think that's what the Greeks were. Maybe they were more primitive in quotes, in the sense they don't have as much facticity as we have, but they understand this struggle as this sort of like feedback of the cosmos. You know, that's an important part. So that's what I wanted to say, and I want to thank Donald for bringing that up, because that's a very important part.
Yeah, this is good stuff. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, you can see how, on the one hand, Hegel's right that in explicating Heraclitus to get at this Greek concept of phusis and becoming and transformation, he has unpacked a tremendous amount of information that is implicit or expressed metaphorically in Heraclitus to show the rigorous structure that Heraclitus thought in terms of, but didn't speak in terms of. You know, he's helping to turn it into a philosophy rather than sort of gnomic insights. But he's not himself an ancient Hegel. He's not able to fully appreciate the ancients' worldview in its own terms. And he doesn't fully appreciate the extent to which that limitation is present in himself. And so he translates Heraclitus into a modernist idiom, because in an ancient idiom, the idea that the human mind would be presented as the pinnacle of anything would be laughable, because the ancients saw nature as the pinnacle. And then they saw the gods below nature, and they saw us below the gods. This idea that anything human could be on top, the best, the absolute truth, the absolute mind, is a very modernist notion, because it's putting people on top. And the flaws inherent in that, this idea of purifying and jettisoning art and religion and nature is all unnecessary now that glorious we have arrived to be the bearers of truth. If that isn't modernist ideology in a nutshell, no matter how beautifully Hegel expresses it or dresses it up or frames it as a dialectic, I haven't seen anything that is. That is a perfect example of the way in which he is not only saying what he's saying, but signing modernism right over the top of it and building it into it, while at the same time thinking he's doing no such thing. He doesn't realize that he's a man with a hammer, and that he's hammering these Heraclitean ideas into a modernist, value system and worldview. That's not entirely perceivable by him, because he is a modern. And because he's a mid-stage modern rather than a late modern, he hasn't yet suffered the crisis of faith in the modernist worldview that all of us have. He still believes the promise of Pico della Mirandola and others, that it could be true. It could be true that we're the best, and that the human mind could be the absolute bearer of truth. That he thinks that might be true. To us, that's more laughable. We can see all the problems where people have attempted to carry out programs based on that, and the terrible catastrophes that have resulted. But he hasn't gone through that disillusionment yet, and therefore he's not aware of what he himself is doing to Heraclitus's philosophies.
Well, in fact, in the discussion, I ended by saying that not only might he be mistaken, being in another false identity, but in fact, he is the end of modernism, because he's already revealed all there is to it. And I said, it seems to me what might come afterwards is not postmodernism, but I would call it a kind of mannerism that traces the aftermath of Hegel, And so this is sort of like, I don't know what you call it, a kind of quasi-late modernism, that is picking parts of it. And so therefore it's segmented into a unified system, because we have picked certain parts of it and developed those parts further, but not into the total unity. So it's not postmodernism, it's a kind of a late mannerist modernism.
Yeah, he's at a tipping point where the inflection of sort of a pure modernist expression in Kant meets the naturalism of Heraclitus as translated through Hegel, and it begins to bend. It begins to change off of Pico's pure, perfect arrow upwards towards heaven and the mind, and starts to take into account the, immanental truth of nature in a way that Kant wouldn't have and couldn't have done, and Pico wouldn't have wanted to do. But like we saw with Pico, and like we see over and over with these people who are at inflection points, it is not possible for him to fully understand what it is that he's doing. He knows he's moving the ball down the field to somewhere new. He thinks he knows what that means, but his interpretation of it is based upon being immersed within those waters. And there's another interpretation possible that is only visible to those who aren't within those waters and can look back on it and go, oh, look what we've set in motion here that we didn't intend. Okay, all right. So this is all good stuff. So let's do the Donald and Sharon exercise and go to the text and work our way through and finish up section B, because I think we have time to get to section C and get started on it today, if people are game. So I'll scroll up a bit again to this first paragraph that I posted. I'll post it again because we've had a few people join since then. And this is, in part 4, End Times Ancient Civilization. This is section B, and this is paragraph 1, 2, 3. This is the second half of paragraph 3, where we're picking back up, and then we'll do 4 and 5 and be done with it. And so what we're seeing here is that, and this is going to be reinforced in the first sentence of the next paragraph, as Donald pointed out. We're seeing a point where Kenneth Smith is starting to tie together the Greeks' insights about the flaws in human nature and the way that we crave falsehood. He's tying that to the first section, where we're talking about the way that nature, the character of things, by which we mean the lawful, authoritative drives of nature, where the principles are these fountains of order that shape everything else that follows. That when we talk about ethos and character in that sense, as the landscape and combination of those fountains, which therefore characterizes the kinds of order that we can expect it to produce or not produce. If we see nature not as our pantry or toolbox, but as this lawful imprint of order and the forms that order can take in the world, on the one hand. And if we comprehend that to the Greeks, kata phusei, according to nature, was the highest form of validation, far above logic. To say how things actually naturally are is more authoritative than anything that we think about nature or want nature to do. That the realm of human ideas and laws is fickle and flows around with fads and misunderstandings, but the realm of nature actually produces all the things that we care about, including us, and therefore it is a higher authority, not just ontologically in terms of what is, but because of that, it's a higher authority epistemologically in terms of what is true or known. And as such, it means that if it is in the human character, if it is inside our own ethos biologically to crave falsehood and to be drawn off the truth, not that we all are all the time, but that it's a huge common liability that we're always having to wrestle with. For that reason, the Greeks put 2 and 2 together in a way that moderns don't. And the Greeks said, holy crap, we have a massive challenge. This is a clear and present existential danger for our entire species, right? If we are just drawn to cliffs, if we're not like the actual lemmings, which do no such thing, but like the proverbial lemmings, if we're racing towards cliffs and hurling ourselves off of them, then we can't afford to be complacent about that. We have to take it seriously, and we have to reorganize. We have to use all the tools at our disposal to try to steer people away from doing that thing that comes naturally to us in our naive character. and to help us to cultivate our character, to garden it, to husband it further, and help it to develop forms to resist those compulsions in us, to become aware of them, to perceive them clearly, and to arrange defenses against them. This is very much like an alcoholic learning that they are an alcoholic, whether they touch a drink or not, and that therefore they, unlike the other people around them who don't suffer from alcoholism, the alcoholic specifically needs to organize their life differently with the awareness that they have this vulnerability other people don't have. So the Greeks are saying our species has this vulnerability other species don't have. And therefore, we really have to organize our entire life, the life individually and the life of our culture, in order to directly address that serious existential threat. This concept of a human being is alien to the modern world. We have no such concept. We are embodied by our creators with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As moderns, we are inalienably injected with a right to be right, the truth, to see things as they are, and to be more just and more good than any people has ever been before. We start out of the starting line believing that we have this ease and naturalness in our attachment to what's real, which is a 180-degree orientation away from the classical concept that we are pseudotropes who are orienting ourselves towards falsehood. So as a result, if it's that easy for us to avoid falsehood as moderns, why not sacrifice all the organs of culture for other purposes? Right? I mean, if it's not a serious threat, why not co-opt art and religion and every other thing we have to make a quick buck? Why not? It's not going to hurt anything. People naturally know what's true, and they might be fooled for a moment, but they'll figure it out and everything will work out and it'll be fine. There's an invisible hand manipulating the marketplace to drive progress and evolution. And that invisible hand is that as moderns, we have an inalienable right to the truth and to knowing what's real. It comes easy to us, we believe. But as such, we turn ourselves into the perfect, victims of con artists. This is the tragic modern condition, because the Greeks understood it's quite the opposite. Our condition is quite the opposite of that. And that therefore, we shouldn't miss any opportunity to try to steer human beings away from the cliffs and towards developing those resources of character that it takes in order to overcome these liabilities. The ancients believed that you should use culture to teach people the disciplines they need to overcome the liabilities in their own character. That is the purpose of culture and civilization. And that is an utterly alien concept to a modern, because their concept of what a Homo sapiens is alien to our concept of what a Homo sapiens is. Their concept of the world and nature is alien to our concept of the world and nature. So they're able to do the philosophical arithmetic and put together these two insights to say, we need to anthropocultivate. We need to cultivate human beings and do everything in our power to do it. So this is why he says, the Greeks intuitively understood how human nature in its most ordinary tendencies, the default, the easiest thing in the world for people, militates against truth and against objectivity, which are the two things that moderns think that they have special access to. The Greeks thought, none of us, Homo sapiens, do not. What did Heraclitus say on this? He said, human nature has no real understanding. Only the divine nature has it. That's Heraclitus on this very point, right? Heraclitus is saying, the human ethos, the human character, its form of understanding is a misunderstanding. We're pseudotropes, we're drawn away from the truth by our nature. We can approximate it, struggle for it, make incremental steps. If we're very disciplined and careful about it, we can do some good in this area because we start out by default being so bad at it. We have room to improve, the Greeks believe, lots of room. To the Greeks, the purpose of the divine is not to find a big monkey in the sky and bow down to him so he doesn't hit us, the way that some versions of religion. For example, the medieval Catholic religion has a streak of obey or go to hell. That was medievalism, right? Very different form of Christianity than modernist Christianity, but it's built in there. And you can read sermon after sermon on this theme. And built into that is the idea that the divine is the divine because it's more powerful than you and it will hurt you if you don't do what it says. But because that sounds bad, it gets dressed up. You know, the orthodoxy had this challenge. The Orthodox medievalism had this challenge that they had to dress that up and make it sound like love. It's part of what's interesting about the Reformation is the way people have stripped these things apart and said, well, what if God isn't a big bully in the sky? What if, what if he's a loving God? What if there's all these other ways to approach Christianity that were not part of the medieval orthodoxy? But if we go back to the medieval orthodoxy, particularly because it arose as a rejection of the ancient concept of the sacred, what we see is, on the one hand, the concept that what is divine because it's more powerful than you and you have to obey it, which is the medieval concept. But on the other hand, in the ancient concept, is this idea that what is divine because it is kalos kagathos, to use Donald's term. It is the good and the beautiful. It is as fit as it is possible to be fit with nature. Maybe more possible, maybe impossibly fit. It is more in harmony with nature than it is possible for a Homo sapiens to be in harmony with nature. That is, to the Greeks, to the ancients, what is sacred because it achieves what human beings should achieve but can't achieve, and thereby gives us clear examples of what it is that we need to be striving toward. Even though we'll never achieve it, we can lift ourselves up from this wretched default in which we pseudotrope and change ourselves into people who struggle against our pseudotropism and respect and admire and strive for, a tropism that orients towards the truth, which is what we associate with the divine. When Heraclitus says human nature has no real understanding, only the divine nature has it, this is what he's saying. He's laying out the relationship between nature at the top, the divine underneath it, and the human underneath that. And that what the divine provides for us is a model of what real understanding would look like to help us understand the nature of our problem and to help us struggle against it. All of this is implicit in this opening sentence. Anytime Kenneth Smith is writing, you should always be watching for what's the Heraclitus he has in mind. Even when he's doing Kierkegaard or Hegel or Hannah Arendt, he's got his buddy right on his shoulder there, always watching, whispering in his ear. So then he says, they sense that the domain of human self-cultivation, and then he says, culture. So on the fly here, he's defining the ancient concept of culture. Culture is not just whatever you happen to do. It's not just the food you eat. It's not just the songs you sing or the dances you dance. It's not just the stuff we do, which is what the modern definition of culture is. And if the modern definition of culture has any more to it than that, it's that we can probably harness culture in some way to make a profit. You could copyright the songs, and now people have to pay you if they want to hear it. You could, teach dance classes. We see ways in which culture can be broken up and turned into a commodity that you can, corner the market on and then allow people to have in exchange for the tokens that they have to run out and earn. To us, that's what culture is. We may not like to think about, the exploitative side of it, but it's part and parcel of our attachment to the law of the excluded middle, that things are what they are and they're not what they're not. Everything is some kind of thing. Culture too must be a thing, and everything is a commodity that has a value. And that value can be used to, advance yourself in society if you can acquire more of it or use it in a cleverer way. So culture too must be some kind of a thing. You could write a paper and describe the culture, and then you're done. That's the culture. That's all there is to it, what has been captured. But to the Greeks, culture is the domain of human self-cultivation. It is the domain in which we struggle against our natural pseudotropism. And it is that because to the Greeks, philosophy and the agon, the struggle to become better than our default, is not only an individual struggle. They believe you need all of the resources of culture to help you leverage against your native idiotism that you're born with. They believe that, and this is an interesting position to take, because on the modernist position of which is more important, the group or the individual, moderns have childish ideas, just like they do about free will versus determinism. It must be one and not the other. This is what we think because of the law of the excluded middle. But what he's saying is, it is neither enough that the group struggles to overcome our pseudotropism, nor is it enough that the individual struggles to overcome their pseudotropism. It requires both. And it requires both because at any given moment, you don't know which of the two partners in this dance is going to be weak, right? Where is the culture wrong and the individual right? Where is the individual wrong and the culture right? And the answer is, it is, of course, cartoonish and ridiculous to assume that one or the other is the bearer of the truth or the bearer of the struggle. It is going to be the case that they are each confused and messed up in different ways, and they each have made advances and strides in different ways. And when you put the two of them together, they can leverage off of each other so that the individual can spot the foolishness of the group sometimes in some situations. And in other situations, the group can spot the foolishness of the individual. And thus, families cultivate their children because the individual child doesn't know enough, doesn't have enough experience, doesn't have enough insight. But at the same time, once people have been cultivated enough, they can start to play an active role in counter cultivating their parents or their society or their civilization. It is in the struggle between the two, the dialectic, that progress is made to overcome our native idiotism. All of this is born in this part of this phrase where he's saying that culture is the domain of human self-cultivation, especially when we combine it with other things that the ancients had to say about philosophy and the agonistic nature of human life, the duty of philosophy to help us overcome. Before I go on, James, you got your hand up. So, oops, I accidentally muted you. You're going to come off mute. Go ahead. You want to?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what is the relationship between culture and nature again? Is culture an expression of the spirit or Geist in nature?
Yes, but in a roundabout, complex way. What a great question, James. So, culture and nature. So there, I think the ancient perspective in a nutshell is this. We talked a month or two ago about how the Greeks saw the human relationship to nature in terms of a whole series of dualities, in which nature has admirable or important or authoritative qualities, and then human beings, when they do their best, try to simulate those within our personalities or our culture. That is, we try to recreate the things that are working in nature. So nature has its form of laws, the logos, which are absolutely authoritative. They create everything. And they have to do with how the archai, the core principles, generate order in the world. But human beings, as a, to take Pico della Mirandola's metaphor, as an unfinished animal, we need to fill in the unfinished parts of ourselves with culture and personal cultivation. And the question is, well, what should we be painting inside that frame? And the Greek answer is, we should be striving to emulate the authority of nature. So we create societies that create laws, nomoi, the nomos, the laws that we declare. But our nomoi do not have the authority that nature's logoi have, because nature's logoi actually do create everything. Whereas human nomoi, we are merely trying to imitate the logoi and harmonize with them in order to reduce the mismatch and reduce the catastrophe and damage. And so point by point, as you look at all the features of nature, you find that at the level of culture and at the level of individual personality, the Greeks are saying you want to try to emulate that, and it is in your nature to try to do that, right? Man is a cultural animal. We need culture to fill in those gaps and to help us harmonize. But it is also in our nature to err and to be drawn to falsehoods And so in the creation of culture, in the creation of nomoi, we have a tendency, what I mean to say is a liability that it is in our nature to have, which is that we're going to do this imperfectly. And it's going to be a struggle to try to pull it off. The mason bee season here is about over. I've only got one or two still out there. And mason bees are amazing, the extent to which they can handle wildly varying climates, like spring in Seattle is all over the place. It's often not sunny enough for them to go out, and they stay holed up in their little tubes, waiting. And if they even get 1 hour of sun in the middle of a really rainy season, out they go immediately, right? And they're out there to get that pollen and nectar the second it's available. And as soon as the sun passes and it's back to rain, back into their tubes they go. But they were able to use that moment beautifully in order to get maybe a few more eggs laid, another little ball of pollen and nectar for them to feed on, and maybe collect some clay and make a little cell in their tube. They, by nature, are optimizing what's available to them and harmonizing with it. Human beings don't have that direct connection to the harmonies of nature. Most of our instincts were evacuated during our evolution. And so we have to try to artificially recreate them with culture. But it is a flawed, indirect process. So that's what they would say would be the relationship between nature and culture. It is in our nature to generate cultures, but it is also in our nature to generate them imperfectly. And thus many of our problems. Great question. That goes right to the heart of the Greek concept that we're talking about here. So he says, they sense that the domain of human self-cultivation culture had to be specifically shaped to police the delusions, illusions, and subjectivism that are the normal media human beings exude for themselves by their every act and assumption. Every time we think, every time we act, we are generating around ourselves an envelope of delusions and illusions and subjectivisms that we mistake for reality. They become the lens system we see reality through, and they warp it. It's not possible to act without generating intent, right? And every idea that we have, however abstract we may think it is, implies a variety of actions that we could take as well. So that we are always caught up in these loops, these feedback loops, in which we are proposing, without thinking about it consciously, a model of reality, which then serves as our lens and mirror system, and then warps our ability to perceive it. And of course, as Heraclitus says, that nature that we are having difficulty at connecting to through this haze is not just the nature around us, but the nature within us. They always see it dualistically. Everything you have to say about nature out here, you also say about nature in here. And that's why we see phrases where they refer to the character of nature or the character of a culture, the ethos. Because even though you might think of character as a personal attribute, somebody's character, they see it as the character of, how do trees grow and how do rivers flow and why does the world work the way it does. And in so doing, it changes the way they understand human character to be the same thing. That is that same lawfulness, that pattern of organization and lawfulness inside of us that's generating our tendency towards delusion and illusion and subjectivism, while at the same time generating the need to make cultures that harmonize with the cosmos, right? We need it, we do it imperfectly. Both of those things come from our nature. So the Greeks, the ancients believed you had to create a domain of self-cultivation that could help people to detect these tendencies in themselves, as well as to detect individual specific delusions or illusions or subjectivisms, and to see through them, to give them another angle on themselves that would let them realize that what they had taken for granted was actually an arbitrary interpretation and that they could do without it. And if they put it aside, they would see the world more clearly. We needed that feedback loop, they believed. Athens was proud of itself for the extent to which it was able to cultivate people to see these problems. They contrasted themselves with Sparta. Sparta, The ratio of free people to slaves was intense. Sparta had enormous numbers of slaves for every free person, whereas Athens at its peak was about a third douloi, about a third banausoi, and about a third aristoi. And even their douloi and banausoi, were marinating in a rich culture full of object lessons about the dangers of idiotia, the dangers of getting caught in your own ideas, the nature of tragedy and how we create our own problems. All this wisdom literature that would help even the most foolish person have a certain bounty of insight into themselves and the world so that they could do better than living at a kind of sub-bestial level. But that's not what the Spartans did, of course. They suppressed their slaves. They had huge numbers of them. They suppressed them violently. They didn't want them to be educated. They were maximizing the difference between the aristoi and the douloi. The human, a broken clock who's right twice a day. That's the interesting thing, right? The Greeks believed that if somebody is cultivated well, then they can be right more than twice a day. But if they're miscultivated, they could actually succeed in never being right. That the range is just too great. And that is both the greatest opportunity, but also the greatest danger of Homo sapiens. We need to do something about that range and try to push it. Try to make the natural expression of character, which we're born with, as positive as possible, so that people can lead less benighted lives, regardless of what their individual character type may be. I'm gonna, even though this isn't the order in which people said things, I'm gonna do Donald and then James and then Phil. The hands that are up, that is. So go ahead, Donald, you first.
When you talk about Sparta and Athens,
yes,
it reminds one, the Spartans didn't believe their slaves could be good soldiers.
right.
I mean, that was something, but that reminded me, I've never drawn this connection before. Towards the end of the Civil War, I think the Southern president, Jefferson Davis, was asked, why don't we conscript our slaves and use them as soldiers?
Yes.
And I recall his reply was, if they make good soldiers, then our theory of slavery is wrong.
Yes.
That they weren't, I guess I'm amazed by two things. One, that Davis was as thoughtful as he was in that answer.
Yes.
And two, that it's a good test because they do make good soldiers, and his theory was wrong, but he didn't want to run the experiment, I guess.
He was afraid of what he learned.
Yeah.
Maybe his entire society was unjust.
Right. And I think there were some helots in Sparta that got promoted to some higher status and they could fight as auxiliaries. But that was, so they were a little more enlightened than others, but yeah.
Like modern slavers, yes.
The modern slavers, yeah. So that's enough on that. But
it's an outstanding point. It's part of how you're in the presence of an ideology. It is always the case that when people are doing unjust things, they try to work out a rationalization for why it may seem unjust, but actually it's just, and we deserve this. And modernist industrialized slavery did a whole lot of that because we're such rationalists. We think everything has to have reasons and must be arrived at scientifically, even if the actual reason we're doing it is because if we steal, all the experts of an entire continent and make them labor for us, then, that's a lot of free labor. It may be unjust, but look how rich we get, right? The real reason underlying it is injustice, but they can't bring themselves to say that because under modernism, that's unacceptable. Under modernism, it has to be scientific and rational. And so therefore they build up all this reasoning. They read the ancients avidly, right? There was a tremendous amount of education in the Greeks, education in Greek literature and history among the Southern leadership. But they always had to read it in such a way that they missed the core lessons. They had to make sure that they never learned the lessons about if you enslave somebody and it is not their nature to be a slave, then what you are doing is evil and you must stop it. And so Jefferson Davis, suspecting that maybe they would make good slaves, but let's not find out, because if we found out, that would mean we're the bad guys. That's a classic modernist little twist of thought there, in order to try to keep the ideology intact and to use science only where we suspect it's going to give us the answers we want to hear, right?
I have been in discussion groups where we read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he has his defense of slavery, and seeing just people just come totally unglued.
Yes.
And then it's, well, wait a minute, read this. According to his argument, modern slavery is not justified.
Exactly.
He's not defending our slavery.
He would think
he
it was
thinks
horrific.
that's terrible.
Yes. Yeah, in the course I took a couple years ago, The Black Past, which did this great history of Africa and the diaspora, one of the points that they made, which is not taught in US history classes, by the way, to this day, even though in theory we gave up our attachment to slavery, is that there's a reason why so many slave revolts in Haiti and Brazil and elsewhere were so successful. And that is, who were we enslaving? We were enslaving engineers, doctors, we were enslaving, politicians, economists. We were enslaving the cream of the crop of Africa, highly educated, incredibly smart, educated, experienced people, telling them to work like dumb brutes, and then being surprised when they successfully organized sophisticated military campaigns that were actually more sophisticated than the slaveholders themselves were capable of organizing. I mean, what did Aristotle and Plato and others have to say about that? They said, this is a system that refutes itself. You are not enslaving people who are by nature slaves. You're enslaving the best and the brightest who by nature should not be slaves. And so everything that you're doing is unjust. There's not a modicum of justice anywhere in this. And their concept of justice is, of course, whether or not you are aligned with the nature of things as they actually are. And the test of that is, you go enslave a bunch of military strategists, guess what they're going to do? They're going to have an amazing slave revolt and kick your ass. And that's what happened over and over in these, increasingly sophisticated slave revolts, until Haiti finally threw off its chains entirely, and then fought off France, and then fought off Spain, and then fought off Britain. In quick succession, 3 navies of 3 industrialized countries were beaten away by this Haitian slave revolt, which, is all the evidence you need that everything about this was just rotten to the core. It can call itself slavery, but in doing so, it is wearing a crown of rationality and justice and human nature that it does not deserve. Much like when people claim that their miscellaneous actions are evolution. It's like, no. Your arbitrary, artificial injustices do not qualify as doing justice to human nature. It's evil instead. This is why it's always hard to talk about these things, because, what does the translator translate the Greek term as? Slavery. So, of course, it must be the same thing. And so we think that we're having an argument about 2 things that are the same, when in fact they're anathema to each other. Anyway, James, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I like this line, the domain of human self-cultivation or culture.
Yes.
It had to be shaped by to please delusions. So is that a process then? Is that what Hegel means by the dialectical process?
Yes.
Which is achieving higher forms of self-understanding and knowledge.
Yes.
So his idea, but he posits that it can achieve a kind of absolute self-understanding. So with that process end there, or is it does it continue as an infinite, endless process?
This goes to Phil's point about the Hegel course he's taking. If Hegel makes the mistake of thinking that you can arrive at an absolute endpoint a culmination of it, then Hegel's not taking his own philosophy seriously enough. Because to be a living system, to be a dialectic, is, in Nora Bateson's terminology, to be in symathesy. That is, you are in an endless, ongoing process of learning from the environment around you and adapting and changing your actions. And you can see this in the Greek concept of the annual competitions for excellence that they had, in which they never said, okay, Sophocles wins this year for Oedipus Tyrannus, and we're done because that's the best. Let's just end here. They never said, we've now arrived at the end of the competition. They always said, well, let's come back next year and see if somebody can beat Sophocles at his own game. Can somebody get a deeper interpretation of human nature, a more, profound reading and understanding of who we are? They, for them, if you arrived at an endpoint where there was one victor and nobody can beat them, what you'd arrived at was stasis. It's a threat to the survival of the civilization. What you actually want is to continue the phusis, the process of becoming, and the agon, the struggle to do better, like Donald was saying. That to be, where is that line? The best ever said and done is only the best ever said and done so far to the Greeks. They weren't locked into a notion that the past has an irrevocable authority over us that we can never overcome. They saw it as an invitation to the contest, to struggle some more, to do better. So it's a different reading, right? Anyway, great question. Phil, then Emma, then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, my thought about culture, because I'm involved in art, which is involved in culture, it is, how should I say, is that our fundamental relationship to nature, or to the world, let's not say nature, to the world, is through our senses, right? This is how we experience. And then out of those senses, we abstract things and could maybe reasonably come up with reasons, calculations, computations of how it works. So reason by itself, a particularly logical reason by itself, is incomplete, because I always think like, okay, that's it, like a very interesting idea, but does it make sense?
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a sense involved as well, right? Does it actually make sense? Because reason that sort of just totally cut off from sense is too much of an abstraction to actually harmonize, you want to put it those words, what the way things really are.
Right.
And my thought is that's why one of the things about the arts is that it's very important. I mean, good art, because there's also bad art that gets you out of art.
Right.
Is that it creates this sort of like inner dimension that somehow seems, in one sense, less visible than reason seems to be, in a funny way, because I guess we're so used to arithmetic and calculations that you say, oh, yeah, that's not part of us, but yeah, we see how that works. And I think there is a connection in this sense, and I wouldn't call sensibilities as being invisible. It's just sort of very translucent once it's in the interior.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to cultivate that, because there is a relationship. That's why you have to be in the world, in some sense, to develop the relationship between sense and sensibility.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that was a good novel. I mean, I think that relationship is always with you. And that's why even somebody who is very, quote, dumb in terms of logic has that relationship. So if you reduce it just to like, if you can't do high mathematics and high computations, then you can just forget it. You exclude it, right? And so in order to incorporate this, I think once you understand that if you could, in some sense, embrace sense and sensibility, that maybe I shouldn't say all, almost all of the people have a sense of that, then you could bring them into a culture of understanding to a certain degree, right? And you have to cultivate that part, not just, well, learn how to be, a statistician or whatever it is, so you get a job. So I think that quite often we think about the reasonableness of something, but we never think about the sensibility of something. And I think that's a part that's missing. And that's the part that I kind of think that I disagree with Hegel to begin with in this sense, is like, no, you don't ever jettison that part.
That's right.
Because, you might want to jettison the heart symbols, like build a monument to Buddha. I mean, but you can't jettison culture altogether, because I think sometimes when you have a symbol, whether it's the cross or whether that's, the hammer and sickle or, or Buddha or whatever it is, it becomes so, how should I say, monumental, then it becomes something else altogether. So,
right.
But developing the sensibility it's a very, very important part of it. And I think, particularly, music does such a good job in that relationship, right? We all appreciate music when it's, when we get to like it, particularly if it's good. So that teaches you something else, like I point out before, like Beethoven says, we don't really understand actually what this higher knowledge is, but it understands us, and we could only, in a sense, understand the music and harmonize with it in that sense. So I think developing sensibility is the first step, and then you can build on top of that reason, and that's perfectly fine. But you can't drop that part off.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's one of the ways in which you look at Hegel sometimes, and you see ways in which he doesn't follow through with his own philosophy, and you see that in the dialectic, where his philosophy leads us to understand Vernunft as a harnessing of both gnosis and noesis, to say that the experiential side, the playful side, the artistic side, I don't know where this is going, but that's okay. I'm going to go and I'm going to learn through this symathesis feedback, is an inescapable and essential part of the mature form of intelligence that we have as a faculty, that it is every bit as important as reason and logic. But because he's a modern, coming from the tradition that he does, he often re-expresses Vernunft as though it is a corrected or perfected form of logic. That is, he uses noetic terminology to describe what's supposed to be, an intermeshing of both gnosis and noesis. And that, you see that in the translations when they talk about absolute mind as being a synonym for Vernunft. It's a distortion in his own theories. And it's part of, these sorts of imperfections are part of the characteristic of things that generate a big following, because it encourages people to become co-creators, to go in there and correct the mistakes. You look at what Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Marx and Arendt and others have had to say about Hegel, and they can point out plenty of things that Hegel got wrong using Hegel's own theories to critique himself with. It's somebody who got everything right, assuming it were even possible, somebody who got everything right and laid it all out, and you just had to take it as it was and there's no room for error, doesn't have anything for human beings to understand, because it is in the errors that we learn so much, whether it's our errors or finally coming to understand somebody else's errors. It's part of why the Greeks thought that the divine can never fully be understood by a mortal, because if it's doing things perfectly, then it's doing things in a way that's incomprehensible to us. We can appreciate the surfaces of it and some of what it means, but we can't fully grok it because we ourselves can't go through that process with it and experience it the way it does. So yeah, Hegel, he's partway there and partway not there. Emma, then Stephen, then Sharon. Go ahead, Emma.
Okay. you know, there were some Greeks that were skeptics and were even atheists, and they're even documented in the historical record, which I find really interesting. But what I wanted to comment on was the statement the comment that was made a little while ago on slavery, because it was really interesting. I mean, when he was talking about Jefferson Davis and his comment on, you know, if this was true, then whatever he thought about slavery wouldn't be true. What I find so interesting about it, thought, is that to me, it illustrates that human beings are basically incapable of actually making moral choices. I mean, if you live in a world in which, you know, literally you can have the Holocaust happening while you have people having a picnic lunch, and they, you know, there's no awareness of the profound effects of suffering. And, you know, within, I mean, I'm Jewish, and I'm, you know, I study Torah, and in Torah we have the same problem with having conversations about slavery. I mean, there's really no way to have a conversation about slavery. I mean, you can read the classics, the Greek classics through and through, and try to find different ways of sort of explaining how the Greeks saw slavery. But, you know, the truth is that slavery was just as brutal and brutish and unfair back then as it was in the modern era. And my sense is that we haven't really learned anything, and that we could very easily reconstitute slavery now. Basically, you know, I mean, I understand what you're saying about the modern view, but I don't know. When I look at someone like Davis, I mean, who is right on the cusp of modernity, and his profound inability to even make any sort of connection with the humanity of the people that have been enslaved. And when I look at the Holocaust, I just think human beings basically haven't changed at all. And we might have different kinds of philosophies to explain our systems of thought, but our essential nature remains the same.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, it's one of the hardest challenges for us as moderns, is that we're looking at the world not as it actually is, but through modernist lenses. Even when we critique modernism, we're critiquing it in a modernist way, which means we are taking for granted all of its assumptions of its core ideologies. It's part of why we talked about this a few weeks back, maybe a month or more back. There is this interesting phenomena in the modern world where people who, you know, rail against the injustices of some particular modernist institution will organize themselves, throw a revolution, set up a new government that, above all other things, the thing they most want is to not make the mistakes of the previous government. And then you follow it for a few decades. And pretty soon, whether it's, you know, wearing the capitalist brand or the communist brand or whatever brand it's got on, there it is, becoming modernism again, reinforcing this notion that people have a right to dictate terms to each other and exploit each other, even if it's for the good of the party versus for the good of private profit. There is this idea of using noesis to create theories of how people are supposed to behave, and then insisting that those theories be followed even when they're demonstrably cruel or false. And you can see that happening under Stalinist Soviet Union, just like you could see it happening, you know, in the US and Cambodia during the Vietnam War. The things that people do to each other on the basis of ideology, all of this, Hannah Arendt says, is typical of moderns. You know, totalitarianism in its modern form has this quality where we are so attached to noesis that we are willing to do horrific things, all the while telling ourselves it's not our fault. We're just obeying the theory or the system or the logic. Nothing personal. We'll say not, you know, a hitman has come to assassinate you. We'll say nothing personal, as though that excuses him, because he actually believes it does. Because all moderns believe going along with the system or the logic or the schema or the line of reasoning, you know, doing that is somehow out of our control, and there's really nothing we can do about it. We just have to follow orders. It's why over and over at the Nuremberg trials, Nazis would try to excuse themselves by saying, well, it can't possibly be my fault because I was just following orders. And we can point at that and laugh and say, see how morally incompetent they are. But then in the very next moment, when we ourselves just follow a system or just follow a logic, we fail to notice that it is the same impulse in us, which is why Hannah Arendt said, when you interview these people, you don't find great monsters of evil, you find very boring, ordinary people. They're very much like us, which shows our own liability to follow wherever we're led by the nose, by a logic or by a system or an orthodoxy or a schema of laws. Now, because we're immersed in this, it's natural for us. And by the way, it is a core tenet of modernism that it is the first system that shows people as they truly are, sees them as they truly are. And therefore, that leads us to think what we witness around us in modern people must be the way people have always been, that we are seeing human nature itself in these examples. But what Kenneth Smith argues is that this is a misunderstanding. It is an inevitable misunderstanding because it is core to modernism that it claims the authority of nature. It claims that it is true to human nature, and it insists we all believe that. But when we actually look closely at the behavior of different epochs and the cultures within them, what we find is people doing things that are completely inexplicable in modern terms. I mean, sure, we can cherry pick examples. There will always be, in any time, people that you can find to draw similarities to. But the thing that we ignore is all of the many occasions when in the medieval epoch, people did something for a medieval reason that was quite incomprehensible to a modern. Or in an ancient epoch, all the times when somebody does something that is quite incomprehensible to us, but makes perfect sense to them. Why would Athens, when struggling under its oligarchy, who had all the privilege and were distorting the entire society and leading them to the brink of civil war, why would they vote into place a tyrant whose job was strictly to fix the Constitution and then step down and not line his own pockets or those of his friends and family? And then he did it, and he stepped down, and Athens proceeds with the new Constitution. When has that ever happened in the modern world? Well, it doesn't, because ancient motivations were different from modern motivations. Their concept of the relationship of the individual to society, to nature, was completely alien to ours. They could do things we can't do, just like we can do things they can't do. So they could have slaves, sure, and they could mistreat them and be brutal, sure. But the other thing that they could do, what they could not do, is have industrialized slavery, scientific slavery, mechanized, using all the forces of science and industry to dehumanize people and turn them into units of production. They never had the capacity to do that, not only because they lacked the technology, but because they didn't conceive of human nature and the nature of the natural world itself in the terms that we do. So for us, what's a simple equation, a reduction of a person to a line item on a sheet, to them, that isn't a way you could even think, let alone a way that you could act. And it's why, in ancient slavery, you can find the most egregious examples all the time in their history, sure. But you could also find examples where the only difference between a slave in Athens during certain periods and a free person in Athens is that the free person could vote and the slave couldn't. And that was it. There was no difference in economics. There was no difference in treatment. There was no difference in human rights in any way except for that. And if that's the standard, then we have to look at the United States, where we disenfranchise enormous numbers. Millions of Americans are disenfranchised and don't have the right to vote. We do that to felons. We do that in districts where we shut down all of the voter registration locations so that they can't get themselves registered as voters. We do that when we apply, extreme tests to prove that you're a voter, and we only apply them in the districts where the other party is voting and not our party. And in our party, we don't apply those. There's all these ways in which we fiddle with the vote to disenfranchise people. Well, by the Greek definition, by the Athenian definition from the classical era, that makes those people slaves. Even if they have everything else, they're being treated as slaves by the Greek definition. But by the modern definition, we claim that they're free because we don't have them in chains, at least not chains you can see. So this is where we get into trouble. This term slave means completely different things in different eras. And if we take an Aristotelian deep analysis of the modern economy, we might conclude that almost everybody is a slave. There are debt slaves who have to labor because they're in debt and they can't afford to be bankrupt. There are wage slaves because they don't have any savings, and if they don't work every single week, they're going to lose their home. There's healthcare slaves. There are people who simply must have the medicine to stay alive, and the costs of the medicine are so exorbitant that if they don't labor relentlessly, they will die. There are slaves. All of us are slaves in terms of housing. It's one of the biggest differences between the medieval epoch and the modern epoch. A medieval peasant couldn't be disenfranchised from the land. Not easily. He came with the land. He always had a home. A modern has no home at all. You have to earn a living. If you want to live, you have to labor in order to have even a place to lay your head down at night. And the moment you stop laboring, your house gets repossessed. So are you free in any sense? Well, by an Aristotelian critique, no, of course not. The ancient Greeks were a slaveholding society, and many of them were just brutalized their slaves. But people had a home, which we don't have. And so it raises questions about the nature of freedom and slavery that the modern epoch does not equip us to be able to see clearly or talk about. All of this stuff gets uncomfortable to talk about, because on the one hand, it sounds like we might be rationalizing the industrialized slavery of the South or any other modernist form. It sounds like we might be rationalizing, hideous Roman exploitation. We're not rationalizing any of that. But what we're doing is looking at the different definitions and comparing cross-historically in order to get a perspective on ourselves that our education and our news media do not prepare us to have, to see the ways in which some of what we call freedom isn't actually anything like freedom. It's become conventional not to notice the ways in which we're shackled. So I'm really glad you raised these issues, because this goes to the core of why Kenneth Smith wrote this entire book. The whole point is, how can we use perspectives of previous epochs to turn them onto the modernist epoch and see ourselves not as natural or normal or inevitable or the best, but instead to see ourselves as actually quite a curious, unusual configuration of cultures that can be critiqued as much as any other series of cultures can be critiqued. How much of what we take for granted is just a shared illusion about how things work. And part of why that's necessary is any epoch that wants to keep going does that in part by convincing the members of that epoch that there are no other choices, that it is inevitable. Just like Thanos in those Marvel movies. I am inevitable. Because if it can convince you that it's inevitable, then you'll just give up and be pacified. So a great deal of the modernist orthodoxy about the nature of people, what is human nature, what is possible for human beings, a lot of that, even though it's portrayed as being objective and true, the actual function of it is to prevent people from escaping modernity by convincing them that it's hopeless. The weird, arbitrary, artificialist things that we do with human beings in the modern epoch, we tell ourselves that's not only normal, it's the only choice there is. So why bother struggling? Just give up. This is all there is. This is as good as it gets. You can see how that forms the structure of a labyrinth to prevent us from being active participants in shaping our world. It tells us to just give in and go along with things. Stephen, then Sharon, then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yes, I'm going to be the contrarian here, because there always has to be a few of us. There's always got to be one or two.
It's important.
But yeah, I'm not really popular with this idea of you moderns always patting yourselves on the head of how great you are when you come to the question of slavery. Like, this seems to be a current fashion that they're going around in circles, engaging in sentimental moralizing about this question, because at the end of the day, people are trying to prove a universal morality, and that's just not there. Now, a la Albert Ellis, if you have a particular moral belief that slavery is bad and you like that belief, I'm cool with that. That's fine. I would like a world in which there's no slaves. But it's a different question when you start treating that idea as some universal morality. And my problem with that is I enslave my own organs. We've got this idea that a single human being is just one unit, which is completely its own. But no, I'm a number of people. In evolution, even the cell enslaved another cell to do its work for it. I mean, what at the times when I was an alcoholic and knocking back a couple of bottles of wine a night, my liver must have looked at me as being the worst and most vicious master in the universe. We've enslaved in evolution our own organs. I'm suspicious that we are not just one person, that all these different entities within us, these organs are all their own people. Every cell is its own person. But yeah, I would just say be wary of sentimentally pursuing morality as a universal. If you think that, oh, this is a moral situation for our group, I desire that, I'm cool with that, that's fine. But this idea that it's a self-evident truth, I'm not so good with, if you understand my meaning. I've been looking at the arguments of Eyre lately on morals, and there's just no apparent justification for universal morality. That's my problem. Okay, thank you. We can't hear you.
Thank you. And to build on what you said, it's not only true if there's not a universal morality, it also works out that way even if there hypothetically were a universal morality. All of these same questions of epistemology that are being investigated here come into play in axiology. How would we be the ones to know right from wrong, right? And how would we evaluate those things? And to what extent do we pursue the wrong because it pleases us and then use clever arguments to dress it up to look like it's right? Like, where do our clothes come from? What percentage of the clothing that we're wearing right now comes out of sweatshops from people who labored in slave conditions, who had their immigration status held over them or some other form of threat to force them to work in inhumane conditions? Where does our food come from? We eat an apple. Who grew that apple? Who picked that apple? Where did it come from? Part of the reason that modernity claims the morality that it does is because it obscures and hides all of the really profound immorality that's going on in order to make these things possible. And then you also have to ask yourself that the issue of she doth protest too much, right? Who is it that claims to be moral the most? Who is it that claims to care the most about human rights? Often turns out to be the worst offenders. And the reason that they're talking about it so much is to point the finger outward and to distract attention away from their own wrongdoing by focusing on the wrongdoing of others. Stephen in previous weeks has talked about in the Ukraine-Russia war that's ongoing right now, how often do we see claims and counterclaims going back and forth about war crimes, which are done specifically in order to distract attention from one's own crimes. It's a really well-known phenomenon. It's really easy to use in politics. And all of this muddies our ability to detect what the actual axiology at work might be. If there were a universal morality, if there were actual issues that we could calculate, it's really difficult to perceive them because we're swimming in so much delusion and illusion and propaganda and spin doctrine and so forth. So it's not to say that it's futile to talk about these things. It's that it has to be done with an eye towards what are the ways in which we're self-sabotaging. I need to step away just for a second to find out who's knocking on my door. I'll be back in just a second. Well, whoever it is, they left, so we're fine. All right. So, these are good things to bring up. And what this goes towards, why does this book even exist? Why are we talking about these things? It is to anatomize and come to understand the nature of the labyrinth we're trapped in. How is it that moderns, like people in any other epoch, have distinctive distortions in our ability to understand ourselves in the world that are characteristic of our epoch? And the more we can understand that, the more we can separate modernist human nature from universal human nature and not confuse the two with each other. People have often behaved differently than moderns do. It's just in modernity, we have a vested interest in suppressing that insight because moderns want modernity to last forever. And one of the ways that they do that is by convincing people there's no alternative, that we represent the pinnacle or the best, or at least the only option. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
So before I start what I had to say, I have a comment. Isn't the difficulty in having universal morality based on culture, the different cultures, different places? Isn't that one of the issues? And then, since we're talking about culture, I kind of read ahead a little bit, and in chapter 14, I liked what Kenneth Smith said, where he says, culture, like human opinion, is for the most part a dream state function, the elaboration of unperceived axioms, which are in their core myth-like fantasies.
Yes.
I thought that said it all and was pretty profound. And then he goes on to talk about aristocratic culture, and then he compares it in the closing paragraph to the modern culture. And this is what he said. He said, aristocratic culture sets itself a self-conscious task, and that's what we're talking about, of transcending the subjective self-indulgences of belief and dogma, considered as forms as idiotia in which people wallow.
Yes.
This historically innovated culture wanted to form itself into a critical or rational culture, a truly connoisseurial way of thinking and living, in which the art of discrimination was better than what was worse.
Yes.
Now, he says for moderns, in modernity's new order of the ages, human beings will be conditioned by a culture, in contrast to the aristocrats, severs them in concept from the principles and influences of nature, from the moral encumbrances such as tradition, culture, authority, and from their own inward, natural, and self-conceived interests. And I think we've talked about this a lot,
yes,
as well as from any competence to evaluate this order critically with their own philosophically cultured resources. And I thought that comparison was a really well-developed discussion of culture.
Yes. Yeah. It's a theme he's going to be working on consistently throughout this book and throughout all of his philosophy, where he's wanting us to break free of our attachment to the modernist belief that modernity is all that's possible and that it's natural and normal. He's trying to get us to see it as an artifice. And through seeing it as an artifice, he's trying to open up the scope of freedom for us to act. Because if we believe there's no point in acting, that nothing could be better than this, then we're pacified. And thus we cease to be agents in working to make a just world or a good world or to pursue the truth. So he's holding up this example of, look at how hard and how intensely these classical Greeks believe you should struggle and strive to do better, and contrast that with the modernist notion that whatever the majority does is ipso facto correct and right, and how you should just give in, just relax, just go with the flow. Don't struggle, right? There is this pacification that's built into the modernist ethos. And it's designed to allow enormous numbers of people to be harnessed into a great economic engine. Because if they believed it was possible for things to be better, if they struggled, it would disrupt, the vested interests. And that's what the vested interests don't want. And so we learn to be pacified. And then following the modernist ideology, we come to believe that state of amoral pacification is normal for us, instead of seeing it as a construct that people spent enormous amounts of money to create in us. And when you look at all the work that's done in think tanks, all the theoretical work, all the work that's done in society to strive to create this consensus that we should just give in, you see how much it's worth to people to have us be pacified. And that should at least raise questions about, well, if this is the way we normally are, why do we have to work so hard in order to convince everybody that this is how we normally are? Or is it that we are working to create a satisfactory lie, right? Something that's useful. Phil, and then I'll go back to the text. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment to what Steve said, and then I'll go on to my thing. Yes, we are enslaving parts of our organs, but that's evolution. That's not me. You got that mixed up, because it seems to me evolution, these cells chose to be in a community for whatever reason. Probably protection was better than a single cell. So it developed out of that evolution. And so therefore, in order to do so, certain parts of it had to submit itself to an order in order to stay, in a sense, alive. So that's just a quick reply to that. My thought is that the problem of absolute anything, absolute mind, absolute ends, and I think there's a problem with utopianism in this sense, as if we know what the hell it is to begin with. And so the only way you go, in a way, justify utopianism is that you have a vision and you have to, what is it? Break a few eggs in order to make a omelet. So
right.
You have a small structure that seems to be working perfectly fine. But wouldn't it be better if we had all the Greece work in this fine way that we have, right? Wouldn't it even be better if we conquer all of Europe and have it be this way? And so this absolutism, in a sense, may eventually evolve, but we don't know in a small incubator how that could apply to something else. Right. So that would be the justification. Sure, a few people will get hurt, but at the end, everything will be fine. We have to pay the price for it. Whether that's Jews, the final solution, get rid of them in order to have this fine thing, or whether that's Stalin, a few eggs will be busted. We can never get there without getting rid of these, rhinos, I suppose. And that would be the justification. To me, that is just not a justification.
Right.
Because that means that you already know that the end that will work. And as far as I'm concerned, maybe I'm just ignorant. I don't know what the end is. I'm happy enough with just moving ahead. And I do not mean that, you don't have any ends. I think of it as like, yes, I have ends. They're called way stations. To go somewhere in a limited way and then stop and make an evaluation, and then move somewhere else. That does not mean I'm just wandering around. I have a kind of a destiny that I have some, maybe it's not far-sighted enough, but I acknowledge my limitations and getting to the way station and building a structure there so that others could progress on to another thing.
Yes.
That's the way it ought to be. So these way stations become a kind of limited end, but they become a means to some other development. And that's the important thing. I don't want, because I know I'm not smart enough, to know what the end is. And if I did know, I would be hesitant in order to project that to begin with. But I do not know. And so I'm glad enough to just move ahead, just the progress. And I think, so in that way, I think of myself as a progressive, but not in the contemporary sense, like as if I think quite often, you think of a progressive as you're asking too much. I'm a little even more reserved than a progressive in that sense. Just progress is good enough.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to the text, but let me do a little quick knitting and talk about the ancients' take on your 2 points. So, there's a connection between what you and Stephen had to say about, morality, even though it might appear that you're in disagreement. And the connection is that the Greeks understood the realm of nature to be older and more authoritative because it was more successful and had been successful for longer. And so, the way that you judge nature is different from the way that you judge an artificial human society. It has to be, because it's been tested over billions of years, whereas what we're doing may have only been tested over decades or centuries, if that. And as a result, we can see, in some sense, we can see the future of nature because of its great past. There is even though it's going to change and transform, there is a successful sequence of transformations behind it, which gives us some confidence that it's going to be able to successfully transform into the future. So the relationships between a flower and a mason bee, have been tested for a long time, millions of years. There is no relationship in any human society that's been tested for millions of years. And for this reason, what the Greeks, used to say is that there are just like there are two kinds of laws, natural law versus human law, with human law being more tentative, more artificial, and so forth. There's two different kinds of justice. That there is a natural justice to the way that nature operates, which is a completely separate question from human justice. And the authority of natural justice is that it has been working for a very long time. And nothing we've ever done comes even close to working for that long. There is a success rate. We can look, in pity at the gazelle being eaten alive by the lions and appreciate that there is a cruelty in it. It may not be it may be a necessary cruelty. And that's where the justice of nature comes into play. That without this pain and the chase, there would be no lions. And lions and gazelles both play a role with each other in a natural ecosystem. But that's natural justice, which is a different consideration for whether one human being should treat another human being that way. Everybody who wants to exploit someone else always claims that natural justice is on their side. They say, well, if lions can kill gazelles, how come I can't kill and eat my neighbor? I mean, I want to, right? I want his liver and the fava beans and a nice Chianti. But in doing that, they are making a categorical confusion that the Greeks insisted we should never make, which is that human justice is a different kind of thing from natural justice. And if all we do is try to put on the mask and costume of nature and claim to have nature's authority, then we're liars. I don't get to eat my neighbor just because I see a lion eating a gazelle, because I'm not that kind of species. I don't have those instincts, and I'm not tested over millions and millions of years to show that this relationship is necessary for the survival of the savannah. None of that applies. Everything about my relationship with my neighbor is much younger than that. I mean, our species is only, 400,000 years maybe, if that. And of that 400,000 years, the amount of it that we can reliably describe because we have historical narratives is less than 1%. So not only are we in no position to claim to hold the mantle and authority of nature and therefore dictate what is moral because I'm imitating nature, we also have no basis even for saying that we are holding true to human nature, because our sample of the possibilities of human nature is so shallow and tiny and parochial that any conclusions we draw from it are inevitably going to be wrong. It's like, I mean, you'd have to run the numbers, but it is very much like in a city full of people, you ask one of them his opinion and you now say that you know the opinion of everybody in the city. I mean, that's what it's like. And so as a result, trying to figure out what is just in relations among human beings is a far more difficult and fraught exercise than figuring out what's just in nature. Because as the Greeks believe, finding out what's just in nature is a different kind of justice, and it is an inherent immanental justice, just like truth in nature is an inherent immanental truth.
Just a sarcastic retort,
Yeah,
right?
please.
Not if we have anything to do with it, we will destroy nature.
Well, yeah. I mean, yes, moderns believe they have the right to do whatever they want with nature, which gets us into a host of trouble. Yes, I agree. Yeah, so there's that. And your second point was not about axiology. Your second point was about, oh, mention it again. I've forgotten, Phil. Tell me what your second point was again. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, he's gonna let it go. All right, we'll come back to it later. All right, so let's go back to the text. So the point then is, when he says not just Greek philosophy, but politics, myth, and tragic drama, and of course he means, and everything else about Greek society, every aspect of their culture, all serve the purpose of curbing idiotism and subjectivism. Because they believed if they used every tool at their disposal, they had a fighting chance. But if they sabotaged any of those tools, then they were going to lose in the battle against the native idiotism we're born into, right? The desire for illusion, the desire to satisfy ourselves, to please ourselves emotionally or intellectually, in questions of morality, the desire to do violence to the questions of morality before us by recasting them in ways that please ourselves. They said these are all not only dire, pressing threats, but we have enormous amounts of evidence that we will make the wrong choices frequently on these things. And so if we are to have any chance of overcoming that, we have to use all the tools at our disposal. Because moderns don't believe in such an existential threat, they believe it's fine to repurpose as many of these tools as you like for any other reason, such as making a quick buck, which is why in modernity, there is hardly an institution left that hasn't been corrupted, because we don't think, human nature is any kind of threat. We think it's fine the way it is. But likewise, at the same time that we think it's fine, you could sabotage all these tools that were being used to hold the dangers of human nature in check, we also don't believe it's possible to do any better than this. So why bother trying? Why waste time trying to make politics or economics or mythology, that would help people become better versions of themselves? Because nothing better than this is possible. Utopias are all stupid, and real politics means that, whatever's happening around us, even if it's a Holocaust, we shouldn't fight it. We should just go along with it. That's just the way things are. Radical passivity is the ethos of modernity. And it is encouraged for the majority so that a minority can become con artists who exploit that passivity in order to profit in the short term. This is the structure of society, according to a Greek analysis. That's what Kenneth Smith is trying to do here, is show us that we can say that we're about freedom and human rights, but when we actually look at what we're teaching people, what we're teaching them is to be the victims of con artists, and creating a society in which the reins of power can be held by anybody. Literally, the cannibal next door who wants to eat you could be president. If you read the Constitution, there's nothing in there saying eating people disqualifies you from being president. Likewise, there's nothing in there that says if it is in your nature to want to exploit other human beings and immiserate them, that's fine, go to. As long as you're voted in, you could do whatever you want. This is the level of seriousness with which we take our political offices. Literally anybody and anything can run us. There's like a handful of requirements. You have to be a certain age. You have to be a U.S. citizen. And once upon a time, you had to be a white male, property holder, but they got rid of those too. So it's pretty much, if you have survived to a certain age and you're a citizen, then no matter how horrific or egregious a character you have, you can run everything. That's fine. because we don't really believe anything's at stake. And this is why over and over and over I come back to that song by Queen, Bohemian Rhapsody, where the man who just killed another man and is now in trouble with the law and is talking to his mama about how he's going to lose everything, goes back and forth between, on the one hand, being full of pity for himself, and on the other hand, saying, nothing really matters to me. Anyone can see. Nothing really matters to me. This is the core of modernity. That none of this matters, that human nature is pointless, nature is pointless, just do what you can to get ahead while you can, and greed is good, as Stephen points out in the chat. This is the core of modernity, and that's really all the core it has. And the rest is just dressing up with ideals, but not actually following through by making change that would be consistent in order to make them be principles. So, all right, so he says that. Let's go back to the text. Let's go back to the text. I know I'm taking us through it step by step, but it's to emphasize these points that he's trying to make. He says, out of these two conditioning ways of understanding how the world of nature works, and this is where Donald's question from earlier comes into play. These two conditioning ways of human nature being that nature is the realm of becoming and the realm of intrinsic truth, and that the two are united together. That's the first conditioning way of understanding. And that's a way of seeing nature we don't see. We don't believe in nature that way. That is alien to us. And then likewise, this concept of custom and nature and their relationship to each other, that we have to struggle to overcome, the liabilities in our character, and that the purpose of culture, the culture has a purpose, and it's a dire, urgent purpose, and that purpose is to help us in that struggle so that we can produce a better quality of people than we would if we weren't doing that. You put these two things together, and he's saying, from this, the Greeks formed a culture of stringent self-expectation. They had demands on themselves. They didn't think you're fine the way you are. They thought that's false by definition. A lion or a gazelle is fine the way it is, but a human being is a different kind of animal. And this kind of animal is not fine the way it is. It needs to strive to do better. So as ephemeral as anything ordinary will be, so humans who expect to accomplish what is enduring, what is remarkable, what is worth memorializing, must indeed strive for what is excellent, the best ever said or done. And as Donald adds parenthetically, so far, right? With the idea that you want to raise the bar, you want to push the level, you want to get to where people treat each other better, you want to get to where we're in greater harmony with nature, you want to try to help each other to raise. The point of the competition in the Greek contests, whether it's the Olympics or the Nemean Games or any of the others, is not just to win. It's to push the bar so that others can be inspired to try harder. Because if nobody's ever done it before, a lot of people will think it can't be done. And then the first person to break that record, all over the Greek world, people are rocked back on their heels, and they realize that they had settled for passivity because they thought it was impossible. But now it's been proven that it is possible. And if that person can do it, maybe if you apply yourself, you can learn how they did it, and then you can do it. This concept of progress that we associate with the 19th century, and which has a certain industrialized amoral quality in the 19th century, had a very different quality in 5th century BCE, Athens, for example. They thought that progress wasn't something that just happened. Progress was something that you make possible through an ethos of striving that allows you to push the bar, push the records, to show that things can be done that people thought were impossible, not just so that you win and you get to be rich at the end, which is the modern version, but specifically so that other people will be inspired, so that they will cast off their slavish passivity and become active and learn that they too can drive the future, that they can be active participants in making things better. And that this was to be applied not just to physical contests like the way we do with sports, but to be applied to the art of composing plays and tragedy, the art of composing music or film, the art of politics and economics, all of these things on every field, we were to be pushing, and trying to establish new benchmarks, new examples that people could thereafter take for granted as being proven to be possible. There is a kind of science of the possible that's built into this culture of Agon, that you're going to demonstrate through evidence that there is a larger circle of possibility than people believe, and that they don't have to settle. They don't just have to passively immerse themselves into what is. So, all right, so there's that. I think that probably goes, I think that probably follows with everything that we said. So next fragment, I think we'll get through this, through part B today. Against the tidal pathos, pathos is a suffering, it is a passivity, it is a relationship in which you must simply accept or endure what is. And pathos doesn't have to be sad or tragic or pathetic. Pathos can be good, right? It can be the case that nature has made you with excellence and that you get to enjoy that excellence. But when you do, that too is a pathos. Nature just made you that way. Pathos can be good or bad, but intrinsic to it is the thing that you can't change, that you have to just endure. And he says tidal pathos, against the tidal pathos that engulfs everyday life, the ebbs and flows of life that we just drift in, right? Those few individuals willing and determined to fight that ordinariness in themselves, are the standard bearers of their civilizational code. So what is he saying here? So first of all, anybody might be willing to criticize other people, right? What makes you extraordinary under the ancient ethos is that you're willing to critique yourself and your own passivity, your own acceptance of things that you shouldn't have accepted, right? We see this gets talked about a lot in modern Jewish literature about the Holocaust, about looking at the varying ways that different people responded to the rise of the Nazis and the emergence of the Holocaust. A shocking number of people just went along with it because it was what was happening, and they had been pacified to such an extent that they believed it was a virtue not to rock the boat. They thought it was a vice to rock the boat. They thought they would be bad people if they fought back. If they said, well, that may be the law, but I'm going to break the law because I believe it's immoral, they had bone deep inculcated into them by their German culture of the time the idea that right or wrong, you have to follow orders. You have to do what the law says. You have to. It's just morally wrong to be an active citizen. You must be a passive civilian. And to do anything else was wrong. And frequently, many of these people not only wouldn't take action themselves, but they would report to the authorities anybody who did. Because in order to immerse yourself into a herd, it's important that there be no counterexamples that make you feel bad about doing them. If somebody near you is fighting the Holocaust while you're trying to go along with it, that creates a problem for people who want to immerse themselves in the herd. And so they solve the problem by calling up the authorities and reporting their neighbor and saying, hey, that person is trying to free some Jews. He's got some Jews in his attic. So, you can come and get the Jews. Yeah, but get him, make him go away so that I don't have the cognitive dissonance of having to look at an example of somebody who's not as pacified as I am. I want to be able to enter the dream state of conformance and go along with it. And that urge to enter the dream state is hardwired into all of us. It's naive infantile gnosis is how we all begin in that dream state. And the disruptions when we're not allowed to stay in it, when we're presented with counterexamples, especially counterexamples that make us feel bad about ourselves, can be really uncomfortable. And people respond to that discomfort in a variety of ways. And what the ancients were trying to do is distinguish, how do people respond to that discomfort? Do they try to push away the discomfort and return to the dream state? Or do they see it as an opening in the labyrinth and say, aha, here is my chance. I have been complacent for too long, and this is my chance to do better than I did before. And it's going to hurt and it's going to be uncomfortable, but I'm going to take that chance because I don't want to be stuck in the labyrinth. I don't want to be pacified by illusions and conformity. I need to struggle against that. And the Greeks wanted to distinguish the two kinds of personalities: who longs for the dream state and who's trying to get out of it. So they saw those people who longed to escape from the dream state as the standard bearers of the ancient Greek civilizational code. This is what Kenneth is saying here. He's not speaking abstractly about being a standard bearer of some civilizational code. He's saying that code of agon, of striving, that code of don't just go with the flow, but figure out what the right thing is to do, even if that means discovering that you've been doing the wrong thing, even if it means you've been a bad person. Still, look at it courageously, assess yourself, and figure out how to do better. This is the core of what they were supposed to be struggling for. And so that's why he concludes by saying they are human embodiments of excellence. This is the excellence that the Greeks wanted more than any other excellence. With, you know, pushing against a high jump limit or a discus limit or a shot put limit or how fast you can run are only metaphors for the real excellence that the ancient ethos wants you to cultivate, which is the struggle against the passivity, against accepting injustice, the struggle against going with the flow, the struggle against conforming. They want the excellence that can turn on itself. Like Heraclitus says, that they don't understand how that which is at variance agrees with itself. There is a harmony in the bending back, as with the bow or the lyre. They want you to turn that agonistic struggle against yourself and harness yourself into a dynamic system that becomes capable of energy and change because you're using it against your own passivity and conformity. This is what this is all about. And so when Donald earlier says, you know, aristocrat isn't the right translation here, he's saying, right, kalos kagathos, the beautiful and the good. It is beautiful and good that a human being string themselves against themselves so that they become a dynamic system for developing character and personality. And the people who do that are the same people who will be willing to challenge the same problem at a culture-wide scale. I mean, if you're not willing to confront your own issues, what good are you going to be at confronting society's issues? It's even harder to confront society. There's so many more people and so much bigger punishments. So this self-overcoming and becoming a human liar, L-Y-R-E, not L-I-A-R, as it were, right, was seen as a threshold test for whether you were likely to be somebody who could forego the many enticements to corruption in politics and instead focus on the struggle to help the culture become better tomorrow than it is today, even at great personal cost. This is what he's talking about here. Thus, the beautiful and the good. In Aristotle's sense, the proper form of a mature adult human being is as recognizable as the proper form of a mature adult cheetah. An adult cheetah can do what a cheetah cub cannot do. The magnificent races across the savannah, the unbelievable, incredible speed and accomplishments that an adult cheetah can do aren't even hinted at in a cub tumbling around and rolling. You can't see the adult form and its possibilities by looking at the cub form. And so Aristotle says the same is true of human beings. People who do not string themselves into this harmony, where they work against their own predilection for delusion. If somebody doesn't do that, you can't see in them what is the amazing and distinctive capacity of a mature human being. But once you see a mature human being actually doing the thing, it is as unforgettable and as unique in the animal kingdom as what a cheetah can do. This is what's being talked about here. Anytime, the good and the beautiful is being raised by someone like Aristotle, they're talking about nature. They're talking about the fit, the form, the function. They're talking about Heraclitean dynamic forces and dynamic systems in order to produce change. And thus you get these forms of unforgettable, beautiful excellence. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I so much believe in what is just said about the Greeks. I'm going to recall a personal example of mine. In 1978, I was a painter, of course, and I was about to finish a painting. And, when you're about to finish a painting, you want to hang it up at a reasonable height so you can look at it, see if it's finished, see if, this is good enough. I want to stop there. So I thought, well, but how high should I hang it? Because there could be at any number of heights, right? Because this is not a museum exhibition. I just want to take a look at it. So I was stuck with a paradox, which is sort of interesting. I said, yes, I could drive the nail into the wall at any number of heights, and that would be good enough. But I also knew that when I do it, it will be at a specific spot. How do I find this spot that I should do, right? Because it seems to me, on the one hand, I could do it anywhere. On the other hand, it will be somewhere. It's kind of like collapsing the quantum wave.
Right.
So I thought, and I finally realized, you know what? I'm going to drive the nail into the wall at 7 feet, 8.5 inches high.
Yeah.
And nobody has understood why I did that, but I did it for a special reason. In 1978, the world high jumping record was 7 feet, 8.5 inches high.
Ah.
And I drove the nail into the wall because I wanted to remind myself that I'm striving for excellence as much as I could.
Yes.
Not necessarily because I achieve it, but I should be ashamed of myself if I didn't give it the good old college try.
Right. Right.
And I would, every time I walk into the studio, I'm just reminded, like, oh, this is what I'm striving for. I'm not going to drive the nail at 3 feet and then say, oh, I did it again.
Right. Right.
I knew I could, and I just did it.
Yes. Yes.
And when I drove the nail at 7 feet, 8.5 inches from the studio floor, I said, oh my God, this is really high. Just to jump over it, And I realized what a damn accomplishment that is. Now, the only difference I have from this advice is that I don't know, there's something that's on the one hand progressive about me, but there's something very reserved about me, is that I don't mind if I inspire people by my personal efforts, but I don't want to be a messiah and go and preach.
Right.
Jump 7 feet, 8.5 inches, or you are an idiot. I mean, I don't want to do that. If they want to ask me, like, well, why is this up so high, that I would explain and I would inspire them. Or they look at my art and they say, yeah, this is very interesting. I'd like to know what you're doing and what. I would explain it, but I'm not going to be an evangelist. Perhaps it's a fault of mine that I should be more of an evangelist. I think there's partly because I'm reserved, but partly because there's a selfish reason.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'd rather be an artist than an evangelist.
Yeah.
And so that was important. And I'll leave it, my statement in my art, not going out preaching in a pulpit. So I think it's important that everybody on some level has some task that mean that are striving for excellence, whatever that might be. Okay.
Yes.
And I think rather than just say, you know, good enough for government work, good enough is good enough, you know, that's not good enough, at least in what you care about.
Yeah.
I think, you know, quite often I do things very sloppily because, you know, that's good enough, you know, it's just for practical reasons. But when something that you really care for, you have to at least strive for that level. And so I just want to say that once again, I'm a Greek.
Thanks, Bill. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, we can't really close this particular passage without bringing up the classic legend of the Emperor's New Clothes.
Oh, yes.
Which has its origins, of course, way before Anderson. Yes. Because you have that point. And this actually was happening all the time. Who's going to be the biggest sale for the trickster, the Emperor or the King? It's like John Law with Louis of France. So you got that problem. They come along and they say, well, unless you can see these invisible clothes, you're an idiot. Mm-hmm. So the entire population decides that they all must see the clothes, otherwise they're an idiot, and you only have the one that at the end of it all, the little boy, who accepts the fact he's an idiot and said, well, I can't see anything. And this is everywhere today. And the counter to it, you've got to ask yourself, if somebody's telling you you're an idiot unless you can see these beautiful set of clothes, you've got to ask yourself, am I an expert in clothing? And am I an expert in what a good fashion is? Yeah. Because the mistake the population made in that story is they were all acting as if they were experts. They felt that by agreeing with what they thought was an expert, that they took on the mantle of being experts, and they're not. But yeah, I'd love you to comment at length on the classic tale, please, Rick.
Yeah, that's a good one. And come to think of it, we talked about maybe having some stories at the end of this book that we would run through the lenses of how would an ancient see this, how would a medieval see it, how would a modern see it. The Emperor's New Clothes has got to be on that list because it's so potent. It's so philosophically potent. It's got that issue of passivity and the pacification and the way that most people want the social rewards and economic rewards and political rewards so much that power can offer them if they kowtow to power, that they just go along with it. It's just too important to them. And you know, this Hegelian, Smithian, Heraclitean, Aristotelian kind of concept of human character, the diverse human characters and how they work, reinforces why the majority would go for it, not because they're bad, but because they're wired that way. They're wired that way. You know, we start out wired to want to do what feels good and avoid what feels bad. And it is the most natural thing in the world at first for any of us. And for a lot of us, it remains the most natural thing in the world forever. All those people would be inclined to go along with, you know, once they learned what the rewards and punishments were associated with, you know, recognizing or not recognizing the Emperor's New Clothes, you would expect them all to go along with it. And it's why the Greeks said, you know, a doulos doesn't have the right to testify in court because you can't trust anything they say. They'll say whatever they need to procure rewards and avoid punishments. And you know, interestingly, that describes pretty much the norm for moderns, that we are to be motivated by what we want. And so if we're, you know, called to be witnesses, why wouldn't we say or believe whatever it is that gets us what we want and avoids what we don't want? We're subject to that in a classical way that fits the Emperor's New Clothes. But the problem is that in modernity, we believe there's only two possibilities: law of the excluded middle, binary thinking. And so if you're not a doulos, you must be a banausos, an intellect, You know, you want to be a rational person, intellectual, a reasonable person, a systematic person. And what we fail to understand is how that leads to the same problem. As Hannah Arendt critiques in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she says, this problem we see over and over again, even in completely politically opposed systems, but that both fall to totalitarianism, we see the same logic at work, where the people submit themselves to the logic of the ideas regardless of whether it's true or not. And they say, well, I have to do it because that's what the logic says. Whether the logic is a set of laws that you have to follow no matter what, whether it's orders from a boss you have to follow or not, whether it's the conclusions implied by the premises of an ideology that you decide to believe no matter what, because otherwise you'd have to question your entire worldview. And all of these things are ways in which people can be every bit as much captured by their ideas as they can be captured by their feelings. And in modernity, which has been engaging in characterological genocide to remove the third character type, this accounts for almost everybody. And the only people who don't fall into one of these two camps nevertheless live their lives as though they fall into one of those two camps, because those are the only two choices modernity offers. You can either be a consumer or a producer. You can be part of the intellectual managerial class, or you can be, part of the proletariat. This is all we offer. And if you want to be the kid who actually notices that the emperor has no clothes and feels it and thinks it and understands it and acts out against society, society is prepared to hammer you back down. They do not want the boat rocked. And so you could sort of see how the emperor's new clothes is actually optimistic. This is a story in which there was at least one budding Aristos in the population that had not been defeated enough that they were willing to speak up and say, hey, all of you people are being weird. I mean, I don't care if I get spanked. You people are being weird. There's no clothes here. And, if modernity succeeds to the extent that it wants to, nobody will ever notice if an ideology is threadbare, if our theories of the marketplace make no sense, if our political parties and slogans make no sense. We're trying to drive out that level of awareness because we're trying to create the perfect consumer, the perfect fan, right? The perfect worker. All these passive roles in which you produce value to be consumed by others. This is what we're trying to maximize. And there's really no place for kids pointing at naked emperors. That's just, we'll have none of that. Well, I'd have to talk with Kenneth a bit. I'll pitch him this one and see if he'll do Emperor's New Clothes as one of the chapters to help close out this book, because I'd be interested to see his take on ancients and medievals and how they would interpret this story. Because you're right, Stephen, it's a doozy. It's got so much to offer. It's a rich one. So thanks for bringing that up. So we're down to the last 7 minutes, and I'm finally reaching the conclusion we won't actually finish the 2.5 paragraphs we had to do today. But we'll get as far as we can, right? We'll be ready for part C next time. So here's the next part of the quote, right? Following up on Stephen's point and my reply, most human beings will not and cannot make the severe commitments, the fidelity to truth or the order of nature. That is to say, he's saying they cannot be kalos kagathon. In the Aristotelian sense, most people cannot be fit to rule. They cannot, because they have too many experiential or conceptual reasons to be corrupted. And by reasons to be, I mean need to be corrupted. Too many people need to satisfy the way that they feel. They need the world to make sense in terms of their parochial experience and their memories. They need to exist at that level because they aren't that way by accident. That is the character of their inner life. That is the lawfulness of their personal nature in their interior, that they are driven by those things, and that they will only use noesis to the extent that it is a servant of their gnosis. They remain inescapably experiential. And by the same token, almost all of the remainder of people, at least in modernity, are slaves the other way around. They're slaves to their ideas. They have rejected gnosis. They fought hard, a lifelong struggle to extricate themselves from the matrix of naive experience. And they view it with contempt and disgust. And that's what allowed them to push back and say, I'm more than that. I refuse to lower myself to an animal basal nature, which is how they describe gnosis. They insist that they are ennobled by following orders, or by following the law or enforcing the law, or ennobled by their adherence to logic or mathematics or any other formal intellectual schema. They have attached themselves to it, and in so doing, by liberating themselves from being slaves to their senses, they have enslaved themselves to a realm of ideas. And in that realm of ideas, they are every bit as helpless in their active egotistical way as a doulos is in their emotionalist, experientialist way. And anybody who is trapped in one of those two character types, by definition, will almost never be willing to violate the thing they've attached themselves to in order to pursue the greater good. Yeah, exactly. With Benalso, you get the dictatorship of the technocrats. Yeah, that's right. Phasis, techne, knowledge, practical things, right? So this is where, and I don't think Kenneth explicates this as thoroughly in section B as he should. What he's basically saying is, contrary to the modern concept that anybody could be president, the ancient Greek concept is almost nobody should be president. And that it is not for the Greeks to dictate who is and who is not, but that you should look to their own nature. You should look to their own character. You should look as objectively as you can, as faithfully and carefully as you can. And whatever their character is, that will tell you whether they're fit to be president. That and only that. Not opinions, not votes, not criteria listed in a document. All of that stuff can be gamed and warped. And that furthermore, to pretend that anybody could be president, to pretend that there's no difference between Martin Luther King and Jeffrey Dahmer, right? Or between, Gandhi and Hitler, to pretend that they're the same, that they're equal, and that they're equally fit, is not only false, but is evil. It's evil to erase the struggle that some people make to be good and beautiful and just, and to pretend that that is not even in the slightest bit better than the people who wallow in their appetites and ideologies. Right? It is a grotesque injustice. And that injustice is the foundation of all modernist forms of government. Right? That we're all this, it's a sin against the spirit, as it were. Because what it says is, first of all, why bother striving? Just give up, right? Because no matter what you do, no matter what you accomplish, we're going to treat you exactly the same as somebody who all their life did the worst thing they could possibly imagine. I'm going to treat you the same as that. They're no worse than you are, and you're no better than them. Either of you could be president. I don't care. It also says everything is meaningless, right? Because if it doesn't matter whether your president is a appetite of ego monster, or an ideological totalitarian monster, or whether they're a good person who's actually trying to do the right thing, then what you're saying is your entire country doesn't matter. The future doesn't matter. What happens doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Ultimately, there is an irreducible nihilism at the foundation of modernist forms of government. By erasing this distinction, it's erasing all distinctions, because it is saying that the people who struggle to learn how to make the distinction don't matter. None of that's worth doing. And so this is bound up in this phrase, and in this recognition of that this is the way that the ancients saw things. We're seeing inescapably an ancient critique of modernity that is built into the difference between how they saw the world and how we saw the world. Once you fully grasp I use the word logic only because it's the only word that to a modern carries the authority. how about that? Once you see the authority of the inescapable conclusions of this critique, you begin to understand how absolutely alien the alien worldview, the ancient worldview is compared to the modern worldview. Because we don't see ourselves that way, but they would see us that way. And I'm sure you could cherry pick a few people in the ancient world who were sort of proto-moderns and would be enthusiastic about this kind of flatland nihilist, worldview, but they would be the exceptions. And it would be obvious all around you would be people staring in horror at what you take for granted. So Phil, go ahead. Got to come off mute.
I just wrote a question like, do you think this is part of the structure of nature? Because it would be hard for me to imagine, let's say in a city of 25,000, everyone is a leader. Right, nobody is a follower. I mean, I could just imagine how that would just fall apart.
It just wouldn't work.
So maybe that is just part of the nature that we have to have plenty of followers and a few leaders, So I just wonder whether that is not a structural part of existence.
Yeah, I mean, it's that we have this diversity of I'm with you, Phil, that we have this diversity of character types is not an accident, and it's not a mistake, right? This is nature and evolution cultivating our species into this form, just like it cultivates lions into lions and water buffalo into water buffalo. It is creating this form of diversity because we don't work as a species without all three character types. And in a modernist sense, we think of it as, some people have to be willing to work so that some people can be free, because we all imagine we'll be the free ones and we'll get someone else to work for us. That's the modernist con game in action. But it's actually more interesting than that. It is that people who are immersed in the day-to-day experience and their feelings are better at a lot of things than people who aren't. They're not distracted, they're focused. There's many things that are essential to the survival of the species that people who have that experience of the world are going to be better at. And we need those things. We don't need them as slaves or followers per se, but we need them. And the same is true of the Banausic impulse, that systematizing, rationalizing, analytical, critical faculty that moderns hold up as the nothing could possibly be better than this form of the mind. It is not as necessary in a day-to-day sense as the immersive Gnosic experience. But if all you have is the immersive Gnosic experience, we fail as a species because we have all these instincts we're missing. And so what an immersive human being does is not as successful as what an immersive cheetah does, right? Cheetahs can afford to be more immersive than we are because they've got the rest of the instincts to make that work. But with those instincts evacuated, we have to compensate for it with a lot of noesis. And without that analysis to act as a foil against the naive gnosis, we fail. But nature's verdict on us is that if all we have is those two things, which is what modernity strives above all to achieve, we also fail. Because two half-witted approaches to the world do not add up to a mature adult full-witted approach to the world. There is that third faculty that's necessary. And only people who, for whatever reason, have the urge and the need to fight against both their experience of the world and their ideas about the world to try to get closer to the world. Only without them, we're not a going concern. But here too, if you had a world made up entirely of Aristoi, it would be just as much a failure as if you had a world made up entirely of Banausoi. So each of them is depending on the previous one to get most of the stuff right. And then the new character type corrects the things that it gets wrong. And the two basal forms, the doulos and the Banausos, still get so much wrong that they still need Aristoi as well. But the notion that the way that we structure it is that everybody should serve the Aristoi, that's probably the artifice that the Greeks got wrong. because they were part of this cycle of colonizer cultures. They can't imagine a culture in which you don't dominate and subjugate a large population to work for you. And so their concept of an aristos was of a group that subjugates a large population. And of course, that led to collapse and the end of the ancient world. That didn't work. So there's some other set of relationships among aristoi, panausoi, and douloi that has to prevail in order for us to work as a functional species. And frankly, we're still struggling to find it. Donald, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
First, no one should misunderstand what I'm going to say as contradicting what Rick just said. Historically at Athens, most of the positions of authority under the state were chosen by lot. Now, this does not mean there's no difference between Martin Luther King and Jeffrey Dahmer. The pool from which they were chosen by lot contained only Martin Luther Kings.
Right.
You know,
right.
And they did not want, I think they feared that the agonistic culture related to who got to be what archon or whatever this year would be destructive of the polis, and you will get your turn in your lifetime, probably. If you're in that group. And the other is I wish you much success in getting Kenneth to do some fiction. I've talked to him many times and saying, if you could write a novel in which one of the characters was an aristos.
Yes.
So that we could look and say, there's what one looks like.
Right.
It would make what you say approachable by a much wider audience, I think.
I think so too.
And at one time, I think I put this in the chat a few weeks ago, he was saying, read Donna Tartt's The Secret History. It's about a small private liberal arts school where they had a Greek professor who taught Attic Greek, classical Greek. And I think when the girls in the class started having rituals on the mountain behind the school where they hunted men and ate them as like following an authentic Greek ritual that was occurred. If men were caught spying on what the women did in their own cults,
they were hunted and eaten.
They were, So anyway, I just liked it. Maybe, but I didn't find that story that authentically Greek, but it was an attempt.
Yes.
An attempt. And I would end what I say by saying you were particularly eloquent today, Rick.
Oh. So, okay. A couple other, just last, here's some links. John Fowles's The Aristos, A Self-Portrait and Ideas, is a book that Kenneth Smith often recommends. And the other one, which I'm going to put here, is by, it's the Alexandria Quartets, a series of 4 books by Lawrence Durrell. I'll put the link here. So before we wrap up, anybody who wants, I'll pause this long enough, you can copy stuff out of there. But it'd be interesting to see if any of this contains portrayals of or attempts to portray aristoi, if that's why Kenneth recommends them. But we'll talk more about this next week. We'll pick up with these final 2 paragraphs and we'll move on to section C. So that's it for this week.
Thanks a lot. It was great.